Have you ever wondered what really happens on cruise ships when passengers are asleep? What I discovered as chief engineer on a Pacific Northwest cruise ship will haunt me forever. These 10 stories come from real crew members and passengers sailing routes between Seattle and Alaska. For privacy, we've changed names and altered identifying details. But I swear every incident actually happened. From impossible disappearances to encounters that defy explanation. These mysteries occurred on vessels you might have sailed on. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop your location in the comments. Subscribe to Mr. Nightveil for more true horror stories. My name is Dutton, and I've been a chief engineer on cruise ships for 12 years. I've worked on vessels across the Caribbean, Mediterranean, and since 2019, the Pacific Northwest routes. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. My world is built on measurements, specifications, and mathematical certainty. Everything on a ship can be explained through engineering principles, stress calculations, and proper documentation. At least, that's what I believed until September 2023. When I encountered something on the MS Northern Star that defied every logical explanation I could construct. I'm a technical person by nature. I trust blueprints more than eyewitness accounts. I believe in steel, rivets, and verifiable dimensions. My entire career has been built on the foundation that ships are predictable, measurable machines. What happened that night didn't just challenge my understanding of maritime engineering. It made me question whether the spaces we navigate are as solid and permanent as we assume them to be. It was 3 a.m. on September 14th when I received the call. We were sailing the Seattle to Ketchikan route, one of the most routine passages in Pacific Northwest cruising. The seas were calm, barely a ripple disturbing the dark water. I was conducting my standard engine room inspection, checking coolant levels and monitoring the main propulsion systems when my radio crackled to life. The night supervisor on sea deck was requesting my immediate assistance. A passenger was insisting their cabin had vanished. My first assumption was that we were dealing with a confused guest. It happens more often than you'd think, especially on the first night of a cruise. People get turned around in identical corridors, misremember their cabin numbers, or simply had too much to drink at the welcome reception. I told the supervisor I'd be up in 10 minutes, finished my engine checks, and made my way to sea deck, expecting to sort out a simple case of passenger disorientation. When I arrived at the corridor, I found the night supervisor standing with an elderly couple in their bathrobes. They looked genuinely distressed, not drunk or confused. The woman was holding a key card in her trembling hand, and the man kept pointing at a section of wall between cabins C246 and C248. They insisted their cabin, C247, should be right there. I looked at the wall. It was solid, covered in the same cream-colored paneling as the rest of the corridor, with a framed photograph of Alaskan wildlife hanging where they claimed their door should be. I pulled out my tablet and accessed the ship's deck plans. According to the digital layout, cabin C247 absolutely existed. The schematic showed it clearly positioned between C246 and C248. A standard interior stateroom measuring 12 feet by 10 feet. I cross-referenced with the passenger manifest. The cabin was listed as occupied, booked under the names displayed on the couple's key cards. Their boarding passes showed they had checked in at Seattle Port. Their luggage had been tagged for delivery to C247, and their account showed active charges from the previous evening's dinner service. But here's what made my engineering mind start to fracture. I stood in that corridor and measured the distance between cabin C246 and C248. Using a laser measuring device I always carry for equipment inspections, I found the distance between the two door frames was exactly 8 feet, 4 inches. according to the deck plans, with C-247 in between. That distance should have been 32 feet, 4 inches. The corridor was missing 24 feet of physical space. I asked the couple to wait while I conducted a more thorough investigation. I needed to verify this against hard documentation, not just digital files that could theoretically contain data entry errors. I went down to the administrative offices and pulled the physical deck plans filed during the ship's last Coast Guard inspection. The paper blueprints, stamped and certified, showed cabin C-247 in explicit detail. Dimensions, plumbing connections, electrical outlets, ventilation duct routing. Everything was documented with the precision required for maritime safety compliance. Have you ever stood in a space that shouldn't exist, or more accurately, stood where a space should exist but doesn't? That's when the real unease began settling into my chest. I returned to C deck with the blueprints and a maintenance crew. We examined the wall where the cabin should be. I knocked on it, expecting to hear the hollow sound that would indicate a sealed doorway or a thin partition. Instead, the wall returned a solid thunk. I had my crew remove the decorative panel and the wildlife photograph. Behind it was standard marine-grade steel bulkhead plating, painted and sealed. No evidence of a doorway. No welding marks indicating a previous opening had been sealed. No structural irregularities whatsoever. The couple was becoming increasingly agitated. They described their cabin in specific detail. Navy blue carpeting with an anchor pattern. 2 twin beds they had pushed together. A small bathroom with a shower that had excellent water pressure. A porthole that looked out over the starboard side, though they admitted this confused them since interior cabins shouldn't have portholes. They had unpacked their belongings, hung clothes in the closet, and slept there for several hours before coming out for a late-night snack. I contacted ship security and requested access to the embarkation footage. The security chief met me in the monitoring room at 4:15 in the morning. We reviewed the recordings from boarding day in Seattle. At timestamp 14:37, clear as day, we watched this couple walk down C-deck corridor, stop at a doorway between C-246 and C-248, scan their keycards, and enter. The camera angle showed them stepping through a doorway that, in current reality, did not exist. We watched them emerge 3 hours later, walk to the elevator, and head to dinner. The footage showed at least 15 instances over 2 days of them entering and exiting cabin C-247. The security chief sat back in his chair and said nothing for a full minute. Then he asked me a question that made my blood run cold. He asked if I remembered the woman who had complained about the cold draft in C-247 on our August sailing. I did remember. I had personally inspected that cabin, checking the ventilation system and sealing a small gap around the porthole frame. I had written a work order documenting the repair, including photographs of the cabin interior. We pulled up the maintenance database. My work order from August 23rd was there, complete with photos clearly showing the interior of cabin C-247. The timestamp on the digital images confirmed I had taken them. I remembered being in that space. I remembered the specific smell of the cabin, that generic cruise ship scent of industrial cleaning products and recycled air. I remembered the couple thanking me for fixing their draft problem. But now that cabin didn't exist. I needed more confirmation. I contacted 2 other engineers who had worked C-deck maintenance during previous sailings. Both of them, when I asked about cabin C-247 without providing context, immediately described repairs they had conducted there. One had replaced a faulty electrical outlet in March. Another had repaired a leaking pipe under the bathroom sink in June. They provided work order numbers. I verified them in the system. All the documentation existed. Photographs existed. Detailed repair notes existed. Multiple crew members had verifiable memories of working inside a cabin that was no longer physically present. At 5:30 in the morning, I made a decision that probably violated several protocols. I went down to the ship's archive storage and retrieved the original construction blueprints from when MS Northern Star was built at the Meyer Werft shipyard in Germany in 2008. These weren't digital copies. These were the actual blueprint sheets, sealed in protective plastic, signed by the naval architects and structural engineers who designed every inch of this vessel. Cabin C-247 was there on the original blueprints. Structural specifications included. Load bearing, calculations completed. Plumbing and electrical systems routed specifically to serve that stateroom. The cabin had been designed, approved, and theoretically constructed as part of the ship's original build. I returned to sea deck as the sun began rising over the Pacific. I brought a measuring tape, not a laser device this time, but an old-fashioned cloth measuring tape that had belonged to my grandfather. I measured the corridor from the forward stairwell to the aft elevator bank. According to the blueprints, that distance should be 147 feet, 6 inches. My measurement came to 135 feet, 6 inches. The corridor was 12 feet shorter than it should be. Exactly the width of cabin C-247. I stood there in the growing morning light, looking at that impossible wall, and tried to apply every engineering principle I knew. Had there been a structural modification during a refit? I checked the complete maintenance history. No modifications to sea deck layout had ever been approved or documented. Had there been damage requiring that section to be sealed? No incident reports existed. Had the original construction deviated from blueprints? Impossible. Ships undergo rigorous inspections at multiple stages. A missing cabin would have been caught by surveyors, Coast Guard inspectors, and insurance assessors. The couple had to be relocated to a different cabin. Their luggage, which they insisted they had unpacked in C-247, was found still tagged and sealed in the ship's storage area, never delivered. Yet they had specific memories of wearing clothes from those suitcases. The woman described a blue cardigan she had hung in the closet. When we opened her suitcase, the blue cardigan was inside, still folded, with visible crease marks indicating it had never been worn or unpacked. I spent the rest of that voyage obsessively measuring sea deck. I documented every dimension, compared them against blueprints, and tried to find some rational explanation for the discrepancy. The corridor remained 12 feet shorter than specified. The wall where cabin C-247 should exist remained solid and undisturbed. The digital deck plan still showed the cabin existing. The physical space did not. Here's what haunts me most. I've been back on the MS Northern Star for 3 sailings since September. Each time, I measure that corridor. Each time, the measurements are different. On the October voyage, the corridor measured 140 feet, 2 inches. Still shorter than blueprints, but not by the same amount. On the November sailing, it measured 144 feet even. The discrepancy changes, but it's always there, always wrong, always unexplainable. I'm a chief engineer. My job is to understand every system, every structure, every measurable aspect of the vessels I maintain. I can calculate load stress on hull plates. I can diagnose engine problems from subtle changes in vibration frequency. I can read a blueprint and visualize the complete 3-dimensional structure it represents. But I cannot explain how a cabin can exist in documentation, in security footage, in multiple crew members' memories and maintenance records, yet be physically absent from the ship. The measurements don't lie. The corridor is shorter than it should be. The space where cabin C-247 should exist is missing. And somewhere, in dimensions, I don't have the tools or knowledge to measure. I believe that cabin still exists, with passengers still checking in, still sleeping in those twin beds, still looking out that impossible porthole at seas I cannot see. My name is Kai Lee, and I'm a radio communications officer working the Pacific Northwest cruise circuit. I spent 4 years in the Coast Guard before transitioning to civilian maritime work, and I've logged thousands of hours monitoring marine channels. I know the difference between atmospheric interference and genuine transmissions. I can identify distress signals from recreational boaters panicking and mild chop versus actual emergencies. My training taught me to stay calm, document everything, and follow protocols no matter what I'm hearing. But on October 19, 2022, I received a transmission that made me violate every reporting procedure I've ever been taught. Because some things are too disturbing to put in an official log. I work alone during the night shift on Celebrity Alaska vessels running the inside passage. My radio room is a small, windowless space on the navigation deck, insulated and climate-controlled to protect the equipment. It's just me, 6 radio receivers, 3 computers running communication software, and the constant static hiss of open marine channels. Most nights are routine. I monitor VHF channel 16 for distress calls, track our vessel traffic service communications, and log weather updates from Canadian Coast Guard stations. The isolation doesn't bother me. I prefer the quiet precision of night watch to the chaos of day shift operations. October in the inside passage means fog. Thick, disorienting fog that reduces visibility to almost nothing and makes navigation entirely dependent on radar and GPS. We were sailing north past Bella Bella, British Columbia, a remote stretch where the nearest settlement might be 30 miles away. The time was 11:47 p.m. when my radio crackled with a transmission on channel 16, the international distress frequency. The voice was male, older, with an accent I couldn't quite place. He identified his location as Point Atkinson Lighthouse and said he needed assistance. I immediately pulled up my lighthouse database. Point Atkinson is a real lighthouse on the southern tip of British Columbia, but it had been fully automated since 1996. No keepers, no resident staff. Just automated beacon equipment maintained by Canadian Coast Guard technicians during quarterly visits. I keyed my microphone to respond, following standard protocol for distress calls. Before I could transmit, the voice continued. He said he'd been trapped in the lighthouse for longer than he could remember, watching ships pass in the darkness. He said he counted passengers on every vessel that sailed by, memorizing their faces through binoculars. Then he started listing names, full names. He rattled off 7 names in quick succession, speaking clearly and deliberately, as if reading from a manifest. I felt my hands go cold. I pulled up our current passenger list and cross-referenced the names he'd mentioned. All 7 were on board. All 7 were currently registered guests on the vessel I was monitoring. The transmission was coming from a lighthouse over 200 nautical miles south of our position. Yet this voice was naming passengers who had boarded in Seattle just 2 days earlier. I documented the transmission in my log, noting the timestamp and channel. I requested the voice identify himself and state the nature of his emergency. The response made my throat tighten. He said there was no emergency anymore, not for him. He'd stopped expecting rescue years ago. Now he just watched and counted and remembered everyone who passed by his light. Then he described specific passengers in detail that shouldn't have been possible. He mentioned a woman in cabin 7042 who was traveling alone after her husband's funeral. He knew she'd scattered ashes off the stern deck that afternoon, something not listed in any passenger activity log. He described an argument between a couple in cabin 8156 that had happened in their stateroom just 3 hours earlier. He detailed a medical condition affecting a passenger in cabin 688. Information that would only exist in our confidential medical files, accessible solely to the ship's doctor. What kind of transmission carries information that exists nowhere except in sealed medical records and private stateroom conversations? I switched to the Coast Guard emergency channel and requested a signal trace. I needed to know where this transmission was actually originating. The Canadian Coast Guard station in Prince Rupert responded within 2 minutes. They confirmed receiving my request and began triangulation procedures. While I waited, the voice continued on Channel 16. He started describing the ship itself, our exact speed, our heading, the number of crew members on night watch. He mentioned a minor hydraulic leak in the starboard stabilizer that our engineering team had been monitoring but hadn't reported to passengers. He knew the name of the captain, the chief engineer, and the hotel director. Then he said my name. He said, "Kylie is alone in the radio room right now, wondering if she should report this conversation. She's afraid no one will believe her. She's thinking about her Coast Guard training and whether this violates any protocols she learned." I stopped breathing. My hands were shaking as I reached for the microphone. I demanded to know how he had that information. The voice responded calmly, almost kindly. He said he could see our ship on his radar. He could see the heat signatures through thermal imaging. He could see me sitting in my radio room, isolated and frightened, making decisions about what to document and what to keep quiet. But Point Atkinson Lighthouse hasn't had operational radar equipment since automation. It's a beacon, nothing more. No surveillance equipment, no thermal imaging, no transmission capabilities beyond the automated light sequence. The Coast Guard contacted me on the emergency channel. Their signal trace results made no sense. The transmission appeared to be originating from Point Atkinson's exact coordinates, but their equipment database showed the lighthouse had no radio transmission hardware. The beacon itself operated on a completely different frequency band. They suggested the transmission might be a pirate broadcast using falsified location data, though they couldn't explain how anyone would know our passenger information or real-time ship operations. I asked them to contact the lighthouse for physical verification. They informed me the lighthouse was unmanned and locked, accessible only during scheduled maintenance. The next inspection wasn't scheduled until December. They could dispatch a vessel to investigate, but it would take at least 6 hours to reach that location in current fog conditions. The voice on Channel 16 spoke again. He said he appreciated my diligence, my commitment to protocol and verification. He said I was exactly the kind of officer the Coast Guard had trained well. Then he began describing my service record. He knew my previous duty stations, the commendations I'd received, and the reason I'd left active service. He mentioned a rescue operation I'd participated in off the Oregon coast, details I'd never discussed with anyone on the cruise line staff. I was no longer following procedure. I was having a conversation with something that shouldn't exist, something that knew things it had no possible way of knowing. I asked directly what he wanted, why he was contacting our vessel. The response came slowly, as if he was considering his words carefully. He said he didn't want anything. He was simply doing what he'd always done, watching ships pass and counting passengers. He said every vessel that sailed past his lighthouse was recorded in his logbook. He knew every name, every face, every story. He remembered passengers who'd sailed these waters 20 years ago, 30 years ago. He said some of them came back, sailing the same routes repeatedly, and he recognized them even when they'd aged or changed. Then he said something that made me close my official log and stop documenting. He said 3 passengers currently on board would never complete this voyage. He provided their cabin numbers. He said he'd already counted them among his permanent collection, people he would watch forever as they passed his lighthouse again and again, trapped in the same journey, sailing routes they could never finish. I pulled up the cabin numbers he'd mentioned. All 3 were occupied. All 3 passengers had checked in normally, participated in ship activities, and had dinner reservations for the following evening. There was nothing unusual about their bookings, no red flags in their profiles. Just ordinary passengers on an ordinary cruise. The fog outside the radio room seemed to press against the ship like something alive. I could feel the isolation of my position, alone with equipment that was showing me things I couldn't explain. The voice asked if I was going to report our conversation. He said he understood if I chose not to. He said many officers had heard his transmissions over the years, and most of them decided silence was safer than trying to document the impossible. I asked how long he'd been broadcasting. The answer came with a sound that might have been laughter or might have been static interference. He said he'd been watching ships since before the lighthouse was automated, since before it was even built. He said the light had always been there in some form, guiding vessels through dangerous waters, and he'd always been the one keeping watch. The Coast Guard contacted me again on the emergency channel. They'd reviewed historical records for Point Atkinson. In 1973, a lighthouse keeper had disappeared from the station during a fog event similar to current conditions. His logbook had been found open to a page where he'd been documenting passing vessels, listing their names and passenger counts. The logbook continued for 3 pages beyond his disappearance, filled with entries in his handwriting, documenting ships that had sailed past days and weeks after he'd vanished. The Canadian Coast Guard had sealed the logbook as evidence that was never explained. Our ship's position showed we were approaching the coordinates where Point Atkinson should be visible if the fog cleared. The voice on Channel 16 said he could see our running lights now, could count the passengers on the outer decks despite the fog. He began listing people by name, describing what they were wearing, what conversations they were having. I verified 3 of his observations by checking security camera feeds. He was accurate. Then the transmission began breaking up. The voice said we were passing his position now, moving beyond his range. He said he'd enjoyed our conversation and hoped I'd sail past again. He said he'd be watching, always watching, counting passengers and recording names in his eternal logbook. The signal degraded into static at exactly 12:34 a.m. I checked our GPS coordinates. We had just passed Point Atkinson Lighthouse's position, though the fog was too thick to see anything beyond 50 feet. I sat in the radio room for another 20 minutes, monitoring Channel 16. But the frequency remained silent, except for normal marine traffic. I made a decision that night that still haunts me. I deleted the transmission log. I removed every reference to the conversation from my official records. I reported a normal, uneventful watch with standard weather updates and routine traffic monitoring. When the Coast Guard followed up about their signal trace investigation, I told them it must have been atmospheric interference that I'd misinterpreted as a distress call. 3 days later, as we docked in Juneau, I learned that one of the passengers had disappeared overnight. Cabin 7219. It was one of the 3 cabin numbers the voice had mentioned. The passenger had been seen at dinner, returned to their cabin, and was simply gone by morning. Security. Footage showed them entering their stateroom but never leaving. The cabin was locked from inside, portholes sealed, no evidence of anything unusual. They were just gone. I still worked night shifts in radio rooms on Pacific Northwest cruise vessels. I still monitor Channel 16 during the lonely hours between midnight and dawn. And sometimes, when we sail past Point Atkinson in heavy fog, I hear that voice again. He's still counting passengers. He's still recording names. And he always knows exactly who's listening. I've never reported another transmission from that lighthouse. Some protocols exist to protect us from things we're not equipped to handle. Some silences are more honest than any official documentation could ever be. My name is Jimmy, and I've been running boats for 31 years. Started as a deckhand on fishing vessels in the Bering Sea, worked my way through cargo transport, did a stint on ferries, and for the last 8 years, I've been operating tender boats for Norwegian Cruise Line. If you don't know what a tender boat is, it's the small shuttle vessel that ferries passengers from the big ship to shore when we anchor in ports too shallow for the cruise ship to dock. It's repetitive work, predictable work, and that's exactly why I like it. Load passengers, run to shore, unload, return to ship, repeat. Same thing every port day, same routine, same counts. Except on July 7th, 2021, in Friday Harbor, when my routine became something I still can't explain without sounding like I've lost my mind. I'm not a superstitious man by nature, despite what some younger crew members think. Yeah, I've got my habits. I don't sail on Fridays if I can help it. I always touch the starboard rail before casting off. And I keep a small saint medal in my wheelhouse that my grandmother gave me 40 years ago. But those are just sailor traditions. Things you do because your father did them and his father before him. They're not the same as believing in ghosts or time travel or whatever the hell happened to me that day. We were anchored off Friday Harbor in the San Juan Islands, one of those picture-perfect Pacific Northwest port days. Clear sky, calm water, tourists excited to visit the whale museum, and cute shops selling overpriced souvenirs. My tender boat, number 3, was scheduled for a 6-hour rotation starting at 8 in the morning. Standard capacity is 42 passengers per trip. Takes about 12 minutes to run from ship to harbor dock. Another 8 minutes to load or unload. Factor in safety checks and turnaround time. I can complete about 4 trips per hour under normal conditions. The morning started perfectly normal. First group loaded at 8:05. Mix of families with kids, couples, a few solo travelers with expensive cameras. I did my safety announcement, checked that everyone had their ship cards, and made the run to shore. Dropped them at the harbor dock, watched them scatter toward the waterfront shops, then headed back to the ship for the next group. Second trip, I loaded another 42 passengers. There was a family of 4 that caught my attention because the father was wearing a bright yellow windbreaker with a Norwegian Cruise Line logo that looked like it came from the 90s. You don't see those old jackets much anymore. His wife had a purple sun hat, and their 2 kids, probably 8 and 10 years old, were arguing about whether they'd see orcas. I remember thinking the boy's voice was particularly whiny. Made the run to shore, dropped them off, headed back. Third trip is when things started feeling wrong. I loaded passengers, went through my routine safety speech, and then I saw them again. The family with the yellow windbreaker. Same father, same purple hat on the mother, same 2 kids having the exact same argument about orcas using the exact same words. Even the boy's whiny tone was identical. I figured they'd change their minds about going ashore. Happens sometimes. Passengers get on the tender, decide they'd rather stay on the ship, come back before we depart. I was about to ask if they'd forgotten something when I noticed the father's jacket. There was a coffee stain on the right sleeve that I was certain hadn't been there during the second trip. Except when I thought about it harder, I realized the stain had been there. I remembered noticing it during the second trip and thinking the guy should have changed before coming ashore. But I also remembered that the jacket was clean during the second trip. Both memories existed in my head simultaneously, equally clear, equally impossible. I ran them to shore anyway. What else was I going to do? By the time I got back to the ship for the 4th trip, I was trying to convince myself I'd been mistaken. Different family, similar clothes. I'd just been staring at hundreds of tourists in quick succession, and my brain was mixing them up. Old eyes playing tricks. But then I saw them again on the 6th trip. Same family, yellow jacket with a coffee stain, purple hat, kids arguing about orcas with the exact same dialogue. This time I was certain. I recognized a small scar on the father's chin. I recognized the specific pattern of wear on the mother's sandals. These weren't similar people. These were the exact same people I'd already transported twice. When I unloaded them at the harbor dock, I did something impulsive. As the father walked past me, I accidentally bumped my coffee cup against his sleeve, adding a fresh stain right next to the one that was already there. He barely noticed, too busy herding his kids toward the gangway. I watched them walk onto the dock, and I specifically noted 2 distinct coffee stains on that yellow jacket. 7th trip back to the ship, I'm loading passengers. And there they are again. 4th time, same family. And the father's yellow jacket has 2 coffee stains on the right sleeve. The fresh one I'd just made and the older one that had been there all along. But I was looking at them before I'd spilled my coffee. The stains were there before I'd created them. Do you know what it's like to watch yourself create something that already exists? To see evidence of your own future actions already present in your past? I started keeping a manual count. Every passenger I loaded, I marked on a notepad I keep clipped to my console. 42 passengers per trip, I'd make a tick mark and note any distinctive features. By noon, according to my watch, I'd made 8 trips. My notepad showed 336 passenger tallies. But I'd marked the yellow jacket family 4 times. And I'd marked at least 6 other passengers multiple times. An elderly woman with a walking cane appeared 3 times. A teenage couple appeared twice. A man with a Seattle Mariners baseball cap appeared 5 times. I radioed the other tender operators during my lunch break. Asked them if they were experiencing any weirdness with passenger counts or repeated families. They looked at me like I'd been in the sun too long. Said everything was running smooth, normal rotation, nobody reporting any issues. I asked specifically about the yellow jacket family. Nobody remembered seeing them. After lunch, I made what should have been my 13th trip. Loaded 42 passengers. The yellow jacket family was there again. 5th time. But when I looked at my notepad, I'd already marked them 6 times. I had a memory of transporting them on a trip I hadn't made yet, or had made and forgotten, or was going to make in a future that had already happened. The timeline was folding in on itself inside my head. The harbor master keeps detailed logs of all tender operations. Every boat has to report arrival and departure times for harbor traffic management. During my afternoon break, I went to the harbor office and asked to see the log for tender boat number 3. The harbor master showed me the digital record. 23 trips logged, arrival and departure timestamps for every single one, running from 8:05 in the morning to current time at 3:15 in the afternoon. But I looked at my watch. It was only noon. I'd been running for 4 hours, not 7 1/4. I checked my phone. It confirmed 12:07. But the harbor office clock showed 3:17. I asked to see the harbor master's watch. It showed 3:17. Every clock in Friday Harbor showed mid-afternoon. My watch and phone insisted it was barely past noon. I'd experienced 4 hours. The harbor log documented 7 1/4 hours. I'd transported passengers on 23 trips according to official records, but I'd only consciously completed 13 trips. There were 10 trips in the harbor log that I didn't remember making. I went back to tender boat number 3 and checked my own logbook. Every tender operator keeps a manual log as backup documentation. I flipped it open to today's date. 23 trips were recorded in my handwriting. Passenger counts, departure times, arrival times, weather notes, everything documented in detail. But I only remembered writing 13 entries. The last 10 entries were in my handwriting. I recognized my specific way of forming numbers, the abbreviations I use for starboard and port, the way I draw a line through my sevens. But I had no memory of writing them. The entries described trips I didn't remember making, transporting passengers I didn't remember loading, noting weather conditions I didn't remember experiencing. One entry specifically mentioned the Yellow Jacket family. Trip number 18. The note said, "Same family again. Fourth time this rotation. Father's jacket has 2 coffee stains. Kids arguing about whales." But trip 18 was one of the entries I didn't remember making. I had somehow documented them during a trip that existed in logs and records, but not in my memory. I counted my manual tally marks. Total passenger tick marks came to 847 individual marks. But 42 passengers per trip times 23 trips should equal 966. I was short 119 passenger marks. Either I'd failed to mark 119 passengers, or some of those trips had carried fewer passengers than standard capacity. But tender boats always fill to capacity on port days. That's the whole point of running rotations. I radioed ship operations and asked for the official passenger manifest for Friday Harbor. How many total passengers had gone ashore today? The operations officer responded, 412 passengers went ashore in Friday Harbor according to ship card scans at tender boarding areas. But I'd personally transported 847 passengers according to my tally marks. Even accounting for the trips I didn't remember, the numbers didn't reconcile. I'd transported more than double the passengers who had officially left the ship. The final rotation call came through my radio at 5:30 p.m. according to ship time. Last call for passengers returning from Friday Harbor. I was exhausted in a way that felt wrong, like I'd worked a double shift even though my watch insisted I'd only been running for 9.5 hours. But every other clock, every official log, every other crew member's experience said I'd been running for nearly 10 hours. I made what I thought was my final trip, picking up passengers from the harbor dock for return to the ship. The Yellow Jacket family was there on the dock, waiting with shopping bags and tired kids. I loaded them onto tender boat number 3. As they boarded, the father smiled at me and said, "Thanks for all the trips today, Captain. Must be at least the 7th or 8th time you've run us back and forth." I wanted to ask what he meant. Passengers only make 1 trip to shore and 1 trip back. That's how tender operations work. But he was already moving past me, settling into a seat, and I had 41 other passengers to load. When I got back to the ship after that final run, I checked my logbook one more time. 29 trips total were now documented. 6 more than the harbor master's log had shown earlier. 6 trips that had somehow been added while I was making my final runs. The entries were in my handwriting. They described trips I absolutely did not remember making. I turned in my logbook to operations that night, like I always do. The next morning, I asked the operations officer if he'd noticed anything unusual about my entries from Friday Harbor. He said everything looked standard. Normal rotation, normal passenger counts, everything by the book. He handed me back my logbook for the next port day. I flipped through the pages. My entries from Friday Harbor were there, but they only showed 14 trips. 14 trips taking passengers to shore and bringing them back, perfectly normal rotation for a 6-hour tender operation. All the extra entries were gone. My handwriting stopped at trip 14. The pages where I documented trips 15 through 29 were blank. But I remember writing those entries. I remember trips that aren't there anymore. I remember transporting a family 8 times who should have only been transported twice. I remember clocks that showed different times simultaneously. I remember hours that existed in logs, but not in my lived experience. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent more than half my life on boats. I know the difference between fatigue and reality. I know when my memory is playing tricks versus when something genuinely impossible has occurred. And I know, absolutely certain, that on July 7th, 2021, I experienced time in a way that doesn't match any clock, any log, or any other person's memory of that day. I still run tender boat number 3. Still transport passengers from ship to shore and back again. But now I count obsessively. I count every passenger, mark every trip, compare my counts to official manifests constantly. Because sometimes the numbers don't match. Sometimes I transport more passengers than officially came aboard. Sometimes my watch shows different time than ship clocks. Sometimes I find logbook entries in my handwriting describing trips I don't remember making. And sometimes, in ports I visited a dozen times before, I see the same passengers again. Same clothes, same conversations, same distinctive features. Moving through their own loops, trapped in rotations they don't know they're repeating. I wonder if they notice. I wonder if they remember me the same way I remember them. I wonder if time on the water works differently than time on land, if there are loops and folds we can't see until we're caught inside them. I'm just a tender boat operator. I load passengers, run them to shore, bring them back. Same thing every port day, except when it isn't. My name is Dr. Zaria, and I've been a ship's doctor for 5 years after spending 12 years in emergency medicine at Seattle General. I chose cruise ship work because I wanted predictable medical cases, controlled environments, and the ability to practice medicine without the chaos of urban emergency rooms. Seasickness, minor injuries, elderly passengers with chronic conditions requiring medication adjustments. That's what I expected. What I didn't expect was to encounter 17 patients presenting with identical symptoms from an impossible source. Symptoms that resolved without treatment and defied every diagnostic protocol I've been trained to follow. I approach medicine scientifically. Symptoms have causes. Physical findings have explanations. When patients present with elevated heart rates, I look for cardiac issues, anxiety, or stimulant use. When pupils dilate, I consider drug exposure, neurological events, or specific toxins. When skin temperature drops, I evaluate for shock, hypothermia, or vascular compromise. Every symptom points toward a differential diagnosis that can be tested, confirmed, and treated. That's how medicine works. That's how reality works. Until March 12, 2023. When 17 passengers simultaneously developed identical symptoms from an event that security footage proves never happened. The call came through my medical bay phone at 1:32 a.m. We were on a routine overnight crossing from Seattle to Victoria, calm seas, no weather concerns. The night nurse told me we had multiple passengers reporting to guest services with medical complaints. Multiple meant more than 2. Which was already unusual for the middle of the night. By the time I reached the medical bay, 7 passengers were waiting. Within 10 minutes, that number had grown to 17. 17 passengers, ages ranging from 23 to 68, different genders, different decks, different demographics. No apparent connection between them, but every single one presented with the same cluster of symptoms. Heart rate elevated between 110 and 125 beats per minute. Pupils dilated to approximately 6 millimeters in normal lighting. Skin temperature decreased by an average of 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit from baseline. Respiratory rate slightly elevated. Blood pressure within normal range but trending toward the lower end. The symptoms were real and measurable. These weren't psychosomatic complaints or anxiety reactions. I had objective vital signs documenting physiological changes. But when I began taking patient histories to identify the cause, every single person told me the same impossible story. They had all gone to the midnight buffet on Deck 11. They had all encountered a crew member serving food from covered warming trays. They had all been offered a specific dish that they described identically. A dark meat in brown sauce with an unusual smell they couldn't quite identify. Most of them had declined the food because something about it seemed wrong. A few had taken small portions, but hadn't eaten more than 1 or 2 bites before feeling compelled to leave the buffet area. And all of them, within 20 minutes of this encounter, began experiencing their current symptoms. I documented their accounts carefully, maintaining clinical objectivity even as the story became increasingly problematic. I asked detailed questions about timing, location, and specific observations. Every patient provided consistent details. The midnight buffet on Deck 11. A crew member in a white service jacket with gold trim, male, approximately 40 years old, with distinctive features they all described identically. The covered warming trays, the dark meat dish with brown sauce and an odor that several patients compared to copper or old metal. Standard protocol for suspected food poisoning or toxin exposure requires immediate notification of ship's operations and environmental health services. I contacted both departments at 2:07 a.m. I also requested security footage from Deck 11's buffet area for the time period between 11:45 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. While waiting for the footage, I conducted physical examinations and ordered toxicology panels for all 17 patients. I was looking for common toxins, organophosphates, heavy metals, biological agents, anything that might explain the symptom constellation. I drew blood samples, started intravenous lines on the 3 patients with the most pronounced symptoms, and prepared treatment protocols for various poisoning scenarios. The environmental health officer arrived at 2:23 a.m. and immediately went to inspect the midnight buffet on Deck 11. He returned 12 minutes later with a report that made my clinical documentation suddenly feel inadequate. The midnight buffet had been closed since 11 p.m. The area was locked, lights off, all food removed, and stored in refrigeration units according to standard procedures. He had inspected the space personally. No warming trays, no food service, no evidence of any activity after the scheduled closing time. How do 17 people experience a medical event triggered by food service that didn't occur? The security footage arrived at 2:41 a.m. I reviewed it with the head of ship security in my medical bay office, while my nursing staff continued monitoring the patients. The footage covered 4 camera angles showing the Deck 11 buffet area from 11 p.m. through 1:30 a.m. At exactly 11:03 p.m., the buffet staff completed closing procedures, turned off lights, locked the service doors, and left the area. From 11:03 p.m. until the footage ended at 1:30 a.m., the buffet area remained empty, dark, and undisturbed. No crew members entered. No passengers entered. The space was completely vacant for the entire period when 17 people claimed to have been there. I returned to the patient area and began re-interviewing. I needed to determine if this was mass hysteria, coordinated fabrication, or some form of shared delusion. But these patients had no prior connection to each other. They came from different parts of the ship. Some were traveling alone, some in couples, some in family groups. Their demographics were diverse. There was no social media coordination, no group activity that had brought them together before the medical incident. I asked each patient separately to describe the crew member they had encountered. Without access to each other's accounts, they provided identical descriptions. Male, approximately 40 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, dark hair graying at the temples, clean-shaven, wearing a white service jacket with gold trim on the collar and cuffs. Several patients mentioned a name tag, though they couldn't recall the specific name. 3 patients mentioned the same distinctive detail. The crew member had a small scar above his left eyebrow. I pulled up the crew database and reviewed photographs of every food service staff member on the ship. None matched the description. The white jackets with gold trim weren't part of our current crew uniforms. That style had been phased out 6 years ago when the ship underwent a rebranding and uniform redesign. I showed patients photographs of current buffet staff. None of them recognized anyone as the person they had encountered. The toxicology results came back at 3:47 a.m., completely normal. No drugs, no toxins, no abnormal compounds in any of the 17 blood samples. Whatever was causing their symptoms wasn't chemical or biological in nature, at least not anything our standard screening could detect. But their symptoms were still present and measurable. Heart rates remained elevated. Pupils remained dilated. Skin temperatures remained decreased. These weren't imaginary findings. I had vital signs documented by 3 different nurses using calibrated equipment. The physiological changes were real, even though the apparent cause was impossible. At 4:32 a.m., exactly 3 hours after the first patient had arrived in my medical bay, something changed. The first patient's heart rate began normalizing. Within 5 minutes, her pupils started constricting. Her skin temperature began rising toward baseline. I immediately checked the other 16 patients. All of them were experiencing the same simultaneous resolution of symptoms. By 4:47 a.m., every patient had returned to completely normal vital signs. Heart rates between 65 and 80 beats per minute. Pupils reactive and normal size. Skin temperatures back to baseline. Respiratory rates normal. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and turned off whatever physiological process had been affecting them. I've never seen a toxin or medical condition resolve so uniformly across multiple patients without treatment. Poisoning doesn't just stop after exactly 3 hours. Anxiety attacks don't affect 17 unconnected people simultaneously and resolve at precisely the same moment. Drug effects don't create identical symptom timelines across diverse demographics without dose variation affecting duration. The patients all requested discharge. They felt completely normal, slightly embarrassed about the incident, and wanted to return to their cabins. I couldn't justify holding them. Their vital signs were stable, their symptoms had resolved, and I had no diagnosis that would warrant continued observation. I discharged all 17 with instructions to return if symptoms recurred. Before they left, I asked one more time about their experience at the midnight buffet. Had they been certain about the time? Could they have been mistaken about the location? Every single patient insisted their account was accurate. They remembered the buffet, the crew member, the food, the smell. Several of them mentioned specific details about the space, the arrangement of tables, the type of serving trays, the color of napkins. But those details didn't match the current buffet setup. They matched the buffet configuration from 7 years ago, before the ship's last major renovation. I spent the rest of my shift reviewing medical literature, searching for any documented cases of mass simultaneous physiological symptoms with identical presentation and synchronized resolution. I found nothing comparable. Mass hysteria can produce psychological symptoms, but rarely creates measurable, objective physiological changes. Toxin exposure doesn't resolve uniformly without treatment. shared delusions don't generate dilated pupils and decreased skin temperature. At 6:15 a.m., I filed my incident report with the cruise line's medical oversight department. I documented every finding, every vital sign, every patient statement, and every impossible contradiction between their accounts and the physical evidence. I described the symptoms as unexplained physiological event with mass simultaneous onset and resolution because I had no better diagnostic terminology. The medical oversight department responded 3 days later, requesting clarification on several points in my report. They questioned whether I had accurately documented the security footage review. They suggested I might have misinterpreted the timeline or overlooked footage showing buffet activity. They implied that 17 patients couldn't possibly present with identical symptoms from an event that didn't occur. So I must have made an error in my documentation or investigation. I reviewed everything again. The security footage was clear and unambiguous. The buffet was empty and locked during the time patients claimed to be there. The toxicology results were definitively negative. The symptom resolution timeline was documented by 3 nurses and confirmed by continuous vital sign monitoring. I hadn't made any errors. Reality had simply presented me with a medical case that had no rational explanation. What terrifies me most isn't the impossible nature of the incident. It's the casual way those 17 patients described their experience, as if attending a midnight buffet that didn't exist was perfectly normal. They weren't confused or uncertain. They had clear, detailed memories of an event that security cameras prove never happened. They interacted with a crew member who doesn't exist wearing a uniform we no longer use in a space that was locked and empty. I've continued working as ship's doctor on Pacific Northwest routes. I monitor the midnight buffet closure procedures more carefully now, though I'm not sure what I'm watching for. I've had 3 more patients over the past 18 months mention attending the midnight buffet during closed hours. Each time, security footage shows empty, locked spaces. Each time, the patients describe the same crew member with a scar above his left eyebrow, wearing the old uniform style. I don't report these cases anymore. The Cruise Line Medical Oversight Department has made it clear they consider my March 2023 incident report to be the result of investigative errors rather than genuine anomaly. But I keep my own records. Patient accounts documented in private notes that won't be questioned or dismissed. Because 17 people experienced something real that night, something that left measurable physiological evidence, even though the source of that experience apparently never existed. Medicine is supposed to be evidence-based. Symptoms have causes. Physical findings have explanations. But what do you document when the evidence points to something impossible? How do you diagnose an event that security cameras prove didn't happen? How do you treat symptoms caused by food served by someone who isn't real in a space that was demonstrably empty? I don't have answers. I just have 17 patient files documenting vital signs that changed in response to an encounter that never occurred. And somewhere on this ship, during closed hours and empty spaces, something is still serving food to passengers who don't realize they're eating from a buffet that exists in a time and place I can't access or explain. My name is Tate, and I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I'm 24 years old. I've been working on cruise ships for only 8 months, and I'm not from here. I came to the United States from the Philippines 3 years ago on a student visa to study marine engineering. This job as a junior machinist on Carnival Cruise Line is how I'm paying for my certification courses. It's how I'm supporting my family back home. It's how I'm building a future. So when something impossible happened during my shift in December 2022, my first thought wasn't about the impossibility. It was about whether anyone would believe me. and whether telling the truth would cost me everything I've worked for. I'm telling you this because I need you to know I have every reason to keep quiet, every reason to rationalize what I saw, every reason to convince myself it didn't happen. But it did happen, and I have evidence. Not the kind of evidence that makes sense, but evidence nonetheless. Technical data that shows something was in the engine room with me that night. Something that left traces in thermographic imaging even though it walked through a locked, watertight door like the steel wasn't there. The engine room on a cruise ship isn't like people imagine. It's not one big space with easily visible machinery. It's a maze of corridors, compartments, catwalks, and mechanical sections spread across multiple levels deep below the waterline. Some areas are loud enough to require hearing protection. Others are relatively quiet. Just the constant hum of ventilation systems and the distant vibration of propulsion machinery. During night shifts, most sections are minimally lit. Just enough illumination to check gauges and conduct safety rounds. It's isolated down there. You can go hours without seeing another crew member, especially during the 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. shift, when I'm usually the only machinist on duty in the lower engineering spaces. December 18, 2022. We were sailing from Seattle to Sitka, Alaska. Routine voyage, calm seas, all systems operating normally. I started my shift at 4 a.m., conducting the standard inspection rounds that junior machinists handle during night watch. Check coolant levels, monitor bearing temperatures, verify pressure readings, document any irregularities. The route takes me through 6 different mechanical compartments over a 2-hour period. Then I return to the engine control room to log my findings and wait for the senior engineer to arrive at 6 a.m. At 4:47 a.m., I was in the auxiliary machinery space on E-deck, the lowest accessible level of the ship, when I heard something that shouldn't have been there. Footsteps. Not the heavy boots that crew members wear in engineering spaces, but lighter steps like someone walking in regular shoes. The sound was coming from the restricted turbine section, an area that requires special authorization to access because of the high temperature equipment and noise levels. I need to explain the access system. Every door in the engineering spaces uses keycard authentication. My junior machinist card allows me access to standard maintenance areas, but not to restricted sections like the turbine room. Only senior engineers and specific maintenance personnel have clearance for those spaces. The doors log every entry. Keycard number, timestamp, duration. It's a security and safety system designed to prevent unauthorized access to dangerous machinery. I approached the turbine section access door. It was closed and locked, the indicator light showing red for secured. But I could still hear the footsteps inside, moving around as if someone was walking through the space inspecting equipment. My first assumption was that a senior engineer had entered before my shift started, and I simply hadn't been notified. It happens sometimes, but protocol requires checking, so I used the intercom system installed on the door panel to announce myself and ask if someone was inside. No response. The footsteps stopped immediately when I spoke into the intercom. Complete silence except for the background hum of ship systems. I waited 30 seconds, announced myself again, and listened. Nothing. I was about to return to the engine control room to check the access logs when I noticed something on the floor near my feet. Wet footprints. Fresh water pooling on the non-slip metal deck plates, forming the distinct outline of bare feet. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. And the prints were leading away from the turbine section door, heading deeper into the auxiliary machinery space toward areas I hadn't inspected yet. Water in the engine room isn't unusual. Condensation from temperature differentials, minor leaks from cooling systems, residual moisture from cleaning operations. But bare footprints? That made no sense. Crew members never go barefoot in engineering spaces. It's a safety violation. The deck plates get hot, there are sharp edges, there's a constant risk of dropped tools or equipment. And these prints were fresh, still wet, still forming distinct toe outlines against the metal. I followed them. I know I should have reported it immediately, called security, waited for backup. But I was thinking about my job, about not causing unnecessary alarm, about what happens to junior crew members who file reports that turn out to be nothing. So I followed the footprints through the auxiliary machinery corridor, watching them lead deeper into the ship's mechanical spaces. The prints led to a narrow access corridor that runs between the main cooling system and the wastewater treatment equipment. It's a maintenance crawl space, basically, barely wide enough for one person, with inadequate lighting and poor ventilation. I grabbed my flashlight and entered. The wet footprints continued along the corridor floor, perfectly clear, heading toward a junction where 3 different access passages meet. That's where I saw him. A person standing at the junction, facing away from me, wearing what looked like casual passenger clothes. Jeans, a button-up shirt, no shoes. He was soaking wet, water dripping from his clothes and hair, forming a pool around his bare feet. The clothes looked wrong somehow, not in style but in condition, like they'd been in water too long and had started deteriorating. I called out, asked if he needed help, asked how he'd gotten down here. He turned around slowly, and I saw his face. Male, maybe 40 years old. Pale skin, dark hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes were unfocused, confused, like he didn't quite understand where he was. He looked at me and asked a single question in a voice that sounded distant, almost hollow. When do we arrive? I told him we were scheduled to dock in Sitka in approximately 16 hours. I asked again how he'd gotten into the engineering spaces. Passengers aren't allowed below sea deck, and the engine room areas are strictly crew only with multiple security checkpoints. He didn't answer. He just turned and started walking down one of the access passages, moving away from me. I followed him, calling out that he needed to stop, that this area was dangerous, that I needed to escort him back to passenger areas. He kept walking, not running, just a steady pace as if he knew exactly where he was going. The passage he'd taken led to a watertight door that sealed off the forward machinery compartment. That door is always locked, always secured, because the compartment beyond contains high-pressure steam lines that require specialized safety equipment to access. What happened next is the part that makes me sound crazy. I watched him walk directly to that watertight door. I saw him reach for the handle, which was locked and wouldn't turn without keycard authentication. And then he just walked through it. Not opened it, not waited for it to unlock. He walked through the solid steel door as if it wasn't there. I saw his wet figure step forward and pass through the door, water dripping off him the entire time. And then he was gone, on the other side, in a compartment I couldn't access. I stood there staring at the door for I don't know how long. The indicator light showed red, locked and secured. I pressed my hand against the steel, solid and cold. I tried my keycard, even though I knew I didn't have clearance. Access denied, as expected. But I just watched someone walk through it without opening it, without unlocking it, without any of the physical actions that should be required to pass through a sealed, watertight door. Can you walk through walls if you're desperate enough, or lost enough, or something other than alive? I radioed the engine control room and reported an unauthorized person in the auxiliary machinery spaces. The senior engineer on duty told me to secure my position and wait, that he was sending security. I stood there by the watertight door, looking at the wet footprints that had followed the person's path to the door, but didn't continue beyond it. The water was still there, still fresh, still pooling around where he'd been standing. Security arrived 12 minutes later with the senior engineer. I explained what I'd seen, trying to sound rational and professional, even though I was shaking. They opened the watertight door using the senior engineer's key card. We entered the forward machinery compartment and conducted a complete search. Empty. No signs of anyone having been there. No wet footprints, no water pooling, no indication that anyone had recently accessed the space. We reviewed the access logs on the senior engineer's tablet. For the past 8 hours, only 2 key cards had been used in the auxiliary machinery spaces. Mine and the senior engineer's from the previous shift. No other access, no security breaches, no unauthorized entries. The watertight door I'd watched someone walk through showed its last opening was at 11:43 p.m. the previous night, more than 5 hours before my encounter. But the wet footprints were still there in the corridor where I'd first seen them. Security documented them with photographs. The senior engineer measured the water temperature. 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Significantly colder than it should be from normal condensation or system leaks. We traced the footprints back to their origin point near the turbine section door. They appeared out of nowhere, no trail showing where they'd come from, just suddenly present on the deck plates. The senior engineer made a decision I'm grateful for. Instead of dismissing my report, he retrieved the thermographic camera we use for detecting heat anomalies in machinery. Thermographic imaging shows temperature variations invisible to the naked eye. He had me walk the exact path I'd followed, and he documented everything with the camera. The thermographic footage showed something impossible. Cold spots following the exact path of the wet footprints. Not just cooler than ambient temperature, but significantly colder, showing up as deep blue on the thermal display against the warmer orange and yellow of the surrounding environment. The cold spots led from the turbine section to the watertight door, exactly matching the path I'd described. And in the corridor where I'd encountered the person, there was a distinct human-shaped cold signature, as if someone's body heat was somehow negative, drawing warmth out of the environment instead of radiating it. The senior engineer saved that thermographic footage to the maintenance database with a timestamp in my incident report. He told me he believed I'd seen something, that the evidence supported my account, but that he had no explanation for what that something was. He advised me to document everything I remembered in writing, file an official report, and not discuss it with other crew members until the incident had been properly investigated. I spent the rest of my shift writing out every detail while it was fresh in my memory. When I returned to crew quarters at 8 a.m., I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that person's face, the confusion in his eyes, the way he'd asked, "When do we arrive?" as if he'd been waiting a very long time for an answer. I kept seeing him walk through that door. Impossible and undeniable. 3 days later, the senior engineer called me to his office. He'd done research I didn't know was possible. He'd accessed historical passenger incident reports from the ship's database, going back to when the vessel first entered service. In December 1997, exactly 25 years before my encounter, a male passenger had disappeared overboard during a Seattle to Sitka voyage. The incident had occurred at approximately 4:30 a.m. in calm seas. The passenger's last known location was on the outer deck above the engine room sections. The senior engineer showed me the missing person report. It included a photograph. The passenger was male, approximately 40 years old, dark hair. I recognized his face immediately. It was the same person I'd seen in the auxiliary machinery corridor. The report noted what he'd been wearing when last seen by his cabin mate. Jeans and a button-up shirt. The exact clothes I'd witnessed. The coordinates where he'd gone overboard were logged in the incident report. I compared them to our current voyage route. We passed through those same coordinates at approximately 4:45 a.m. on December 18th, 2022. Within 2 minutes of when I first heard the footsteps in the restricted turbine section. The senior engineer told me that passenger bodies lost at sea in the Pacific Northwest often aren't recovered. The water temperature, the currents, the depth. He said sometimes families never get closure, never know exactly what happened. He said he believed the passenger was still looking for arrival, still waiting for the journey to end, still walking through the ship trying to understand when he would finally reach his destination. I've completed 15 more voyages since December 2022. I still work the 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. shift. I still conduct maintenance rounds through the auxiliary machinery spaces. And 3 times, on voyages that pass through those same coordinates at approximately the same time, I've heard footsteps in the restricted turbine section. I've found wet footprints appearing from nowhere. I've caught brief glimpses of a figure in passenger clothes, always distant, always disappearing before I can get close. The senior engineer who believed me transferred to a different vessel 6 months ago. The new senior engineer dismissed my subsequent encounter reports as equipment echoes and condensation patterns. But I keep my own records now, separate from official maintenance logs. I photograph the footprints with my phone. I document the thermographic anomalies when I can access the camera without authorization questions. I note the coordinates and timestamps in a private notebook I keep in my locker. I'm working toward my engineering certification. I'm supporting my family. I'm building my career one shift at a time in these deep mechanical spaces where most passengers never know anyone works. But I'm also watching the coordinates, noting the timestamps, preparing myself each time we pass through the spot where a passenger went overboard 25 years ago and never stopped trying to arrive at his destination. Some people get lost at sea and stay lost. Some people get lost inside the ship, walking through locked doors, searching for an arrival that never comes. I see him sometimes in the deepest parts of the engine room, always soaking wet, always confused, always asking the same question in that hollow voice. And I never have an answer that would help him. I can only tell him how many hours until we reach the next port, knowing that's not the arrival he's waiting for. The thermographic camera still shows those cold spots when I check. The access logs still show no unauthorized entries. The watertight doors still remain locked and secured. But someone is walking these corridors anyway, passing through barriers that should be solid, leaving wet footprints that appear from nowhere and fade before anyone else can see them. I'm the only one who looks for him now, the only one who acknowledges he's still here, still traveling, still waiting for someone to tell him he's finally arrived. Every voyage takes me through those coordinates at least once. Every time, I'm alone in the auxiliary machinery spaces during the early morning hours. And every time, I wonder if tonight will be the night I hear those footsteps again, see that confused face, try to answer a question that has no answer I can give. He's been lost for 25 years. I've only been working here for 8 months. But somehow, we're both trapped in the same impossible space, both trying to understand things that engineering principles can't explain, both waiting for journeys that might never end. My name is Kalani, and I've been a shore excursion manager for Holland America Line for 19 years. I manage every aspect of port operations, booking tours, coordinating with local vendors, tracking passenger movements, ensuring everyone returns to the ship before departure. I'm meticulous about documentation. I keep multiple backup systems. I verify everything twice, sometimes 3 times. Because in this job, one missed passenger means a delayed departure and thousands of dollars in port fees. My reputation is built on perfect record-keeping and zero incidents. That's why what happened in Juneau on August 14th, 2021, destroyed me professionally and personally, because I have documentation proving something impossible occurred. And no one believes the records I've spent 19 years perfecting. I need to state this clearly from the beginning. I am not careless. I do not make booking errors. I do not lose track of passengers. Every excursion I book goes through a 5-step verification process. Passenger requests the tour, I enter it into the booking system. Passenger signs a waiver. Payment is processed. Vendor receives confirmed manifest. I've processed over 40,000 shore excursions in my career. My error rate is 0.02%. And those errors were minor discrepancies like misspelled names, not missing passengers, or phantom bookings. August 14th was a port day in Juneau, Alaska. We had 8 different shore excursions scheduled: glacier tours, salmon bakes, helicopter rides, gold panning, kayaking, downtown walking tours, Mendenhall Glacier visits, and whale watching. The whale watching excursion was particularly popular that sailing. I had 64 passengers booked across 2 charter boats. The first boat departed at 9 a.m. with 32 passengers. The second boat was scheduled for 1 p.m. with the remaining 32 passengers. I personally checked in all 32 passengers for the 9 a.m. whale watching tour. They assembled at the designated meeting point on the pier at 8:45 a.m. I verified their ship identification cards, confirmed their names against my manifest, collected signed liability waivers from each participant, and watched them board the charter vessel operated by a local tour company I'd worked with for 7 years. The boat departed at 9:03 a.m. Return time was scheduled for 1:30 p.m. All aboard time for the ship was 4 p.m., giving them more than 2 hours of buffer. At 1:45 p.m., I received a call from the tour company dispatcher. The whale-watching boat had returned to the harbor, but none of my passengers were on board. The captain reported that the 32 passengers I'd checked in never arrived at the vessel that morning. He'd waited at the dock until 9:15 a.m., then contacted the tour company office to report a no-show group. The dispatcher had tried calling my ship phone repeatedly between 9:20 a.m. and 10 a.m., but I had no record of receiving those calls, and my phone log showed no missed calls during that period. I immediately reviewed my documentation. I had 32 signed waivers in my excursion folder, each with a different passenger signature, dated August 14th, 2021, timestamp showing 8:47 a.m. to 8:56 a.m. I had my own checklist where I'd marked off each passenger as they boarded the charter boat. I had a photograph I'd taken of the group on the vessel before departure, standard procedure for insurance documentation. Everything indicated that 32 passengers had boarded that whale-watching tour. The tour company insisted their captain and crew never saw those passengers. They had photographs from their own documentation showing an empty vessel at 9:03 a.m. Their boat capacity logs showed 0 passengers transported that morning. But they confirmed receiving my manifest the previous day and had prepared accordingly. 32 life jackets laid out with name tags matching my passenger list. 32 seats arranged. 32 information packets prepared. I contacted ship security and requested keycard scan data. Every passenger uses their ship identification card to exit and re-enter the vessel. The scans are logged with timestamps. Security pulled the data for all 32 passengers on my whale-watching manifest. According to keycard records, all 32 had scanned out of the ship between 8:38 a.m. and 8:51 a.m., consistent with them leaving for the excursion. All 32 had scanned back into the ship between 9:15 a.m. and 9:47 a.m., less than an hour after they'd left. That made no sense. I'd watched them board the charter boat. I had photographic evidence. But the keycard data showed them returning to the ship, while I believed they were still on the excursion. I went to the passenger cabins to verify their locations. All 32 passengers were in their cabins or in various locations around the ship. I spoke with 6 of them directly. Each one denied booking the whale-watching excursion. They showed me photographs on their phones documenting their morning activities. Breakfast in the dining room, spa appointments, pool time, onboard trivia games. The timestamps on their photos covered the exact period when I believed they'd been on the excursion. One passenger showed me a selfie taken on the pool deck at 9:11 a.m. I had checked her onto the whale-watching boat at 8:52 a.m. According to my records and my memory, she had been on that charter vessel. According to her phone, her keycard scan data, and her own testimony, she'd been on the ship the entire morning. I returned to my shore excursion office and examined the signed waivers more carefully. 32 different signatures, each appearing genuine with natural variation in penmanship. I contacted our document verification specialist, who works with customs and immigration paperwork. She compared the waiver signatures to the passengers' original embarkation documents signed when they boarded in Seattle. Handwriting analysis confirmed matches. The signatures on my whale-watching waivers were written by the same people who had signed their boarding documents. But those passengers insisted they never signed any whale-watching waivers. They never booked the excursion. They had never met me at the pier that morning. The tour company sent me photographs of the 32 life jackets they'd prepared. Each life jacket had a name tag attached. Each name tag exactly matched my manifest. The names were handwritten by the tour company's crew member who prepares equipment. She confirmed writing those names based on the manifest I'd sent. She remembered preparing those life jackets specifically because it was a full group, and she'd commented to a coworker about the large booking. So I had physical evidence of an excursion that was prepared for but never happened. Passengers who scanned out of and back into the ship but never left. Signed waivers from people who denied signing them. And my own clear memory of checking in 32 passengers and watching them board a boat that the captain insists remained empty. I spent the next 3 days obsessively reviewing my records, searching for an explanation that would preserve my sanity and my professional reputation. That's when I discovered something that made everything worse. I searched my booking database for similar patterns. The system stores all transactions going back 2 years. I filtered for whale-watching excursions booked through that specific tour company. 4 previous sailings showed identical patterns. June 2021, May 2021, April 2021, March 2021. Each sailing had a whale-watching booking for exactly 32 passengers. Each booking showed signed waivers, payment processing, and manifest confirmation. Each booking resulted in the tour company reporting no shows, while my records indicated successful check-in and boarding. I had been processing ghost bookings for 4 months without realizing it. The tour company had been charging us for no-show groups without questioning why the same pattern kept repeating. I had signed waivers, photographic evidence, and detailed documentation for excursions that 5 different boat captains insisted never transported any passengers. The financial implications were significant. Each whale-watching tour costs $180 per passenger. 32 passengers times 5 incidents equals $30,240 in charges for excursions that apparently never occurred. But the payments had been processed. The tour company had deposited the funds. From a financial standpoint, the transactions were legitimate and completed. I analyzed the demographics of the 32 ghost passengers across all 5 incidents. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. Ages ranged from 31 to 64. Gender split was exactly even, 16 males and 16 females. Cabin locations were distributed across different decks, with no concentration in any specific area. None of the passengers had any connection to each other before the cruise. They weren't traveling in groups, weren't from the same booking agent, had no shared characteristics except being part of my manifests for excursions that simultaneously did and didn't happen. When I checked those same passengers' booking histories, I found something that made my hands shake. Across all 5 sailings, 23 of the passengers had sailed with us before. And in their previous cruises, several of them had also been part of shore excursion bookings that I couldn't verify as actually occurring. The pattern extended backward through my database, creating a web of questionable bookings involving passengers who repeatedly appeared on excursion manifests for tours that may or may not have happened. I reported everything to my supervisor: the contradictory evidence, the financial discrepancies, the repeating patterns. The investigation that followed was humiliating. Auditors reviewed my procedures, questioned my documentation methods, suggested I was either fraudulently processing bookings to receive kickbacks from tour vendors or experiencing some form of cognitive impairment that affected my memory and record-keeping. The handwriting analysis was dismissed because passengers must have signed the waivers at some point, possibly for different excursions that I'd misfiled. The keycard data was considered more reliable than my memory. The tour company photographs showing empty vessels were weighted more heavily than my photographs showing passengers boarding. My 19-year perfect record became evidence of someone finally cracking under the pressure of flawless performance. I was removed from shore excursion management and reassigned to general passenger services. A formal notation was placed in my personnel file citing documentation irregularities and inconsistent record keeping. The tour company was reimbursed for the 5 no-show bookings, with the funds deducted from my department's operating budget, effectively penalizing me financially for incidents I still cannot explain. But here's what nobody investigated thoroughly. Those 32 passengers from August 14th. I tracked them obsessively after the incident. Over the following 6 months, 8 of them booked another cruise with Holland America. And every single one of them appeared on shore excursion manifests for tours that showed the same contradictory evidence pattern. Check-ins, I remembered, but vendors couldn't confirm. Signed waivers that passengers denied completing. Keycard data showing impossible timelines. One passenger appeared on 4 different sailings over 8 months. Each time, she was part of a shore excursion booking that created documentation inconsistencies. Each time, she denied participating in the excursion, produced photographic evidence of being elsewhere, and had keycard data that contradicted the manifest records. But I had her signature on waivers. I had her face in group photos. I had clear memories of checking her in personally. I started keeping a private database, separate from company systems. I documented every passenger who appeared in these contradictory excursion patterns. The database grew to include 127 passengers over 14 months. These passengers shared no obvious characteristics. They booked through different travel agents, came from different regions, had varying demographics, but they all appeared repeatedly in shore excursion bookings that existed in documentation but not in reality. The tour company started flagging these bookings. Captains would call before scheduled departures, asking if the groups were definitely coming because of the previous no-show patterns. But from my perspective, the groups always showed up. I always checked them in. I always watched them board. The disconnection between what I experienced and what everyone else confirmed became my professional nightmare. My supervisor eventually suggested I take medical leave. The implication was clear. Either I was deliberately creating false documentation, or I was experiencing some form of early-onset dementia affecting my memory. Both explanations would end my career. I refused the medical leave and continued working in my reassigned position, but I kept investigating privately. The signed waivers remain the most disturbing evidence. I had them analyzed by 3 different handwriting experts, paying for the examinations personally. All 3 confirmed that the signatures matched the passengers' verified handwriting samples. The signatures were genuine, created by the actual passengers, not forgeries or digital manipulations. But those passengers insisted they never signed any such documents and had never participated in those excursions. How do you forge someone's signature using their own hand? How do you create memories of events that security cameras and multiple witnesses confirm didn't happen? How do you generate documentation that satisfies forensic analysis while simultaneously being impossible according to every other form of verification? I'm 56 years old. I've built my entire adult life around being the person who keeps perfect records, who never loses track of anyone, who ensures every passenger gets exactly the experience they booked. And now I'm the shore excursion manager, who processed $30,000 in ghost bookings, who has signed waivers from people who deny signing them, who watched passengers board boats that captains swear remained empty. The waivers are still in my possession. I kept copies before the company investigation, knowing they might be destroyed or disappeared as embarrassing evidence of my supposed incompetence. I look at them sometimes, studying the signatures, reading the printed names, remembering the faces of passengers I checked in for excursions they claim never to have booked. The paper is real. The ink is real. The signatures match. But the experiences they document apparently never occurred. 32 passengers boarded a whale watching boat on August 14th, 2021. I watched them. I have photographs. I have their signatures on liability waivers. I have manifests and check-in logs and payment confirmations. But they were also on board the ship the entire time, documented by keycards and photographs and their own testimonies. They were in 2 places simultaneously, or they were never on the excursion at all, or I'm experiencing a reality that diverges from everyone else's evidence. I still work for Holland America, though no longer managing shore excursions. I still see those passengers sometimes on subsequent sailings. They don't recognize me. They book different excursions, participate in different activities, live their cruise experiences without any awareness that they're part of a pattern I can't explain. And I keep my private database, adding new names each time the pattern repeats, documenting an impossible phenomenon that cost me my career and my credibility, but continues regardless of whether anyone believes it's real. My name is Mike, and I don't tell stories. I'm 61 years old, been working ships for over 40 years, spent 2 tours in Vietnam before that, and I've seen enough genuine horror that I don't need to invent any. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in premonitions. I believe in steel decks, proper knot tying, and keeping your mouth shut about things that'll make people think you've lost your edge. But something happened during a storm watch in February 2023 that I can't explain away, can't rationalize, and can't forget, no matter how hard I try. So I'm telling it once, right now, and then I'm never speaking about it again. I'm a deck maintenance supervisor for Princess Cruises, working the Pacific Northwest routes. My job is keeping the exterior spaces safe, securing equipment, maintaining walkways, checking railings, making sure nothing breaks loose during rough weather. It's physical work, unglamorous work, and I prefer it that way. I've got a small crew under me. Mostly younger guys who think they're tough until they work their first real storm. I do the night watches myself during bad weather because I don't trust anyone else to catch problems before they become disasters. February 9th, 2023, we were running an overnight passage from Vancouver to Astoria. Weather forecast showed a significant storm system moving in, nothing we couldn't handle but enough to warrant proper preparation. Wind gusts predicted at 45 knots. wave heights building to 12 feet, temperature dropping to just above freezing. Standard Pacific Northwest winter conditions. I started my watch at 2 a.m., doing a complete exterior deck inspection before the storm hit full force. The ship was buttoned up tight. All deck furniture secured with tie-downs, equipment stowed, passengers restricted to interior spaces. I walked the observation deck on Deck 7, checking every lashing point, testing every rope, making sure nothing would come loose when the weather turned. The wind was already picking up, and I could feel the ship starting to roll as we hit heavier seas. That's when I saw him. Another deckhand working near the stern, securing a row of lounge chairs that I'd already checked 20 minutes earlier. He was using old-style manila rope instead of the synthetic lines we'd switched to years ago, working with techniques that were solid but outdated. I didn't recognize him, which was unusual because I know every member of my deck crew, and I definitely knew we didn't have anyone else scheduled for exterior watch during storm conditions. I approached him, intending to ask what the hell he was doing out here without authorization and where he'd gotten that manila rope from. As I got closer, I noticed his uniform was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but off in small ways. The color was slightly faded, the cut was an older style, and the Princess Cruises logo on his jacket was a version we'd stopped using at least 15 years ago. He was maybe 30 years, old, dark hair, medium build, working with the efficient movements of someone who'd done this job 1,000 times. Before I could say anything, he looked up at me and spoke. His voice was calm, almost casual, like we were colleagues who worked together regularly. He said the storm was going to get worse, much worse than the forecast predicted. He said we'd see sustained winds of 65 knots with gusts to 80, and wave heights would peak at 23 feet around 4 a.m. He said I should double-check the lifeboat davits on the port side because one of the hydraulic lines was developing a slow leak that would fail under extreme stress. I asked who he was and what watch he was assigned to. He smiled, just a slight one, and said he was finishing his rounds on the Pacific Star. That name stopped me cold. This ship hadn't been called the Pacific Star in over 15 years. She'd been rechristened the Princess Aurora in 2008 after a major refit and corporate rebranding. Nobody who currently worked this vessel would refer to her by the old name unless they were reading historical documents. I looked at him more carefully. His equipment wasn't just old style, it was era-specific. The type of rope, the style of securing clips he was using, even the flashlight clipped to his belt was a model we'd phased out more than a decade ago. He worked with practiced efficiency, completing the tie-downs on the lounge chairs with knots I recognized from my early days at sea, but rarely saw anymore because newer crew learned different techniques. I asked him directly when he'd last worked this ship. He paused in his work, looked out at the darkening sea, and said he worked every storm. He said someone had to make sure the equipment stayed secure, that passengers stayed safe, that the same thing didn't happen again. Before I could ask what he meant by again, he moved to the next section of deck furniture, working his way toward the stern. The wind was increasing, and I had my own work to complete. But his warning about the lifeboat davits bothered me. That was too specific to ignore, especially from someone who clearly knew this ship's equipment, even if I didn't know him. I made my way to the port side lifeboat stations and inspected the davit hydraulic systems. The third lifeboat from the bow showed signs of a slow hydraulic fluid leak, exactly as he'd warned. It wasn't critical yet, but under extreme stress during heavy seas, that system could fail. I radioed maintenance to get an emergency repair crew on it immediately. By the time I returned to where I'd seen the deckhand, he was gone. I searched the observation deck, checked the exterior walkways, looked in equipment lockers where crews sometimes take shelter during rough weather. Nobody. I radioed my crew and asked if anyone else was conducting exterior rounds. Negative. I was the only person authorized to be outside during storm conditions, and security had no record of anyone else scanning their keycard to access exterior decks. The storm hit with a violence that made the weather forecast look optimistic. By 3:45 a.m., we were taking sustained winds of 63 knots, with gusts exceeding 75. Wave heights reached 22 feet, close enough to the prediction that deckhand had given me that it couldn't be coincidence. The ship handled it well, rolling heavily, but maintaining course. All the deck equipment I'd secured stayed in place. The lounge chairs that mysterious deckhand had been working on remained locked down throughout the worst of the storm. What kind of ghost warns you about hydraulic leaks and predicts wave heights with technical precision? At 4:17 a.m., the hydraulic system I'd reported failed despite the emergency repairs. The maintenance crew had started work on it, but the storm intensified faster than they could complete the fix. If that failure had occurred while trying to launch lifeboats during an emergency, it could have been catastrophic. But because I'd reported it early based on the deckhand's warning, backup procedures were already in place. No one was endangered. The system was isolated and secured. When my watch ended at 6 a.m., I couldn't let it go. I went to the crew records office and started searching through archived personnel files. I was looking for deckhands who had worked this vessel when she was still called the Pacific Star, specifically focusing on the 2008 period around the rechristening. The digital records went back only 10 years. But the ship's historian maintained paper archives of crew rosters, photographs, and incident reports from the vessel's entire service history. I found what I was looking for in a file marked Critical Incident, October 2008. During a Category 4 storm in the same waters we'd just sailed through, the Pacific Star had encountered extreme weather that damaged exterior equipment and endangered passengers. One section of unsecured deck furniture had broken loose, creating a cascade failure that injured 3 passengers and nearly caused more serious casualties. A deckhand had gone outside during the height of the storm against direct orders to secure the loose equipment. He'd succeeded in preventing further injuries, but was swept overboard by a rogue wave while completing the tie-downs. His body was never recovered. The incident report included a crew photograph taken 2 months before the accident. I recognized him immediately. Same face, same build, same age as the deckhand I'd seen working on the observation deck. The report listed his name, his years of service, and a commendation noting that his actions during the storm had likely saved lives, even though those actions cost him his own. The equipment he'd been securing when he went overboard was in the same location where I'd seen him working that night. The lounge chairs on the stern observation deck, the exact spot where he'd been using that old manila rope and outdated tie-down techniques. He'd died making sure passengers would be safe. And apparently, he was still doing that job 15 years later. I've worked through dozens of storms since February. I've done countless night watches on exterior decks in rough weather. And 3 more times, I've seen him. Always during significant storms, always working with that old equipment, always securing deck furniture in the areas that need it most. He doesn't speak much during these encounters. Sometimes just a nod of acknowledgement. Sometimes a brief warning about specific hazards I should check. He never stays long, and he's always gone by the time the storm peaks. I don't tell my crew about him. They'd think I'm losing my mind, that 40 years at sea has finally broken something in my head. I don't file reports about a deckhand who died in 2008, still showing up for storm watch. What would I write? encountered deceased crew member performing safety rounds, received accurate weather predictions, equipment remained secure. But I've learned to trust his warnings. When he says a storm will hit harder than forecast, I prepare for worse conditions. When he mentions specific equipment that needs attention, I check it immediately. He's been right every single time. The hydraulic leak, a weakening deck plate, a corroded bolt on a safety railing that would have failed under stress. He sees things I miss, knows this ship in ways that go beyond standard maintenance knowledge. Other crew members have mentioned seeing a deckhand they don't recognize working exterior decks during storms. They assume he's part of some other watch rotation, someone from a different department handling specialized equipment. Nobody questions it directly because everyone's too busy managing their own responsibilities during rough weather. But I've checked the schedules, reviewed the security logs, confirmed the watch assignments. There's never anyone else authorized to be outside when he appears. I found his family after researching the 2008 incident. His sister still lives in Seattle. I thought about contacting her, telling her that her brother is somehow still protecting passengers, still doing the job that killed him. But what would that accomplish except making her relive the loss? What comfort is there in knowing someone you loved couldn't rest because they died trying to keep others safe? I'm 61 years old. I've got maybe 4 more years before mandatory retirement. I've survived combat, survived decades at sea in every kind of weather, survived accidents and close calls that should have ended me. I've seen men die, seen ships sink, seen storms that made experienced sailors pray to gods they didn't believe in. I thought I was beyond being surprised by anything the ocean could throw at me. But I wasn't prepared for this. I wasn't prepared to meet someone who died doing his job and couldn't stop doing it even after death. I wasn't prepared to receive help from a ghost who checks equipment and predicts weather and saves lives by continuing a watch that should have ended 15 years ago. I see him and I nod acknowledgement. He nods back. We don't need words between us. We're both old sailors doing the same job. Keeping watch through dangerous weather, protecting people who'll never know we were there. The only difference is I'll eventually retire and go home. He never will. My name is Amanda, and I work in guest services for celebrity cruises. I've been in the hospitality industry for 11 years, 6 of those specifically in cruise operations. My job is solving problems, managing complaints, and maintaining systems that keep thousands of passengers happy during their vacations. I'm good at my job because I'm organized, detail-oriented, and committed to making sure every record is accurate and every passenger feels valued. I avoid conflict when possible, prefer documentation over confrontation, and believe that most problems have logical, administrative solutions. Which is why what happened during a 3-day San Juan Island sailing in May 2022 has destroyed my ability to trust any system, any record, or any passenger interaction as genuinely real. I need to start with the complaint because that's how it all began. May 13th, 2022. Second day of a Seattle round-trip cruise through the San Juan Islands. Standard 3-day sailing, light passenger load. Beautiful weather, no operational issues. At 2:47 p.m., I received a noise complaint at the guest services desk. The complaint came through our internal messaging system from cabin 8142, reporting excessive noise from the adjacent cabin and requesting immediate assistance. Standard procedure for noise complaints. Verify the complainant's information. Check occupancy of adjacent cabins. Contact the source of noise. Mediate the situation. I pulled up cabin 8142 in our passenger management system to confirm the guest's name and contact information before responding. The system showed the cabin as occupied, booking confirmed, payment processed, but the passenger name field displayed as Data error. Unable to load. That's unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes the system has temporary glitches with special characters in names or recent booking modifications that haven't fully synchronized. I attempted to call cabin 8142 using the internal phone system. No answer. I sent a message through the in-cabin television system asking the guest to contact guest services at their convenience. No response. I decided to conduct a personal cabin visit, which I do for about 30% of complaints because face-to-face interaction often resolves issues faster than electronic communication. I arrived at cabin 8142 on deck 8 at 3:15 p.m. Standard interior stateroom, identical to hundreds of others on the ship. I knocked on the door, announced myself as guest services, and waited. No response. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I used my master key card to enter, following protocol for welfare checks when guests don't respond to multiple contact attempts. The cabin was empty. Completely empty. No luggage, no personal belongings, no signs of occupancy. The bed was made with the tight hospital corners that housekeeping uses for unoccupied cabins. The bathroom showed no evidence of use. No toiletries, no damp towels, no water spots in the sink. The cabin looked exactly like it would on embarkation day before any passenger had checked in. I returned to my office and pulled the complete booking record for cabin 8142. The manifest showed full details. Passenger booked March 17, 2022, paid in full April 3, 2022, checked in at Seattle Terminal May 12 at 11:23 a.m., keycard activated and issued. The system recorded 3 keycard entries to the cabin, May 12 at 1:47 p.m., May 12 at 6:34 p.m., and May 13 at 8:12 a.m. According to our records, someone was occupying that cabin and had accessed it multiple times. I contacted housekeeping and asked about cabin 8142. The assigned steward confirmed the cabin was occupied, stated he'd serviced it that morning, and noted the passenger had left personal items in the room. He described seeing a suitcase on the luggage rack and toiletries in the bathroom. When I told him I'd just inspected the cabin and found it empty, he insisted that was impossible because he'd cleaned it just 6 hours earlier and the passenger's belongings were definitely present. I went back to cabin 8142 with the steward. We entered together at 4:02 p.m. The cabin was still empty. No luggage, no belongings, nothing indicating occupancy. The steward stood there staring in confusion, insisting he had cleaned this exact cabin that morning and had seen a suitcase and toiletries. He pulled out his electronic task log showing cabin 8142 serviced at 9:30 a.m., with notes indicating occupant present, room service tray collected, standard turndown requested for evening. How does a cabin go from occupied with personal belongings at 9:30 a.m. to completely empty by 3:15 p.m. when the keycard logs show no entries or exits during that time period? I checked the dining reservations. Cabin 8142 had confirmed reservations in the main dining room for all 3 nights of the cruise. The reservation system showed the passenger had checked in for dinner on May 12th and had a reservation pending for tonight, May 13th. I contacted the dining room manager and asked if anyone remembered seating a guest from cabin 8142 last night. 2 servers remembered serving that table. They described the passenger as polite, ordered the salmon, had 1 glass of wine, tipped appropriately. When I asked for a physical description, both servers became vague, couldn't recall specific features, but insisted they definitely served someone at that table. I pulled the spa reservation system. Cabin 8142 had booked a massage appointment for May 13th at 10 a.m. The appointment showed as completed, payment charged to the cabin account, service notes indicated relaxation massage, 60 minutes, client satisfied. I called the spa and spoke with the massage therapist who had the 10 a.m. slot. She confirmed providing the service, described the client as quiet and pleasant. but when I asked for any identifying details, she couldn't provide specifics. She remembered the appointment happening, remembered it going well, but couldn't describe the person's appearance, age, or any distinguishing characteristics. The photo gallery system showed cabin 8142 in multiple group photos from embarkation and the first evening's deck party. I accessed the digital images. In every photograph where cabin 8142 should appear, there was a blurred figure. Not motion blur, not camera error, but a consistent distortion effect that made the person's features completely unidentifiable. Other passengers in the same photos were perfectly clear, sharp focus, normal exposure. Only the person from cabin 8142 appeared as a blur, as if the camera couldn't properly capture their image. I started interviewing other passengers. Room numbers adjacent to 8142, people who had been at the same dining table, passengers visible in the same group photos. 5 passengers remembered interacting with someone from cabin 8142. They remembered conversations, remembered seeing the person at various ship activities, but none of them could describe physical features. One passenger pulled up a selfie on her phone that she'd taken with the nice person from 8142 during the deck party. In the photo, she was clearly visible, smiling, with her arm around a blurred figure that distorted the image where a face should be. Can you exist in photographs, in conversations, in service appointments, and in dining reservations while simultaneously not existing in any verifiable physical form? I reviewed the security camera footage. Our system covers all public areas and corridor access points. I tracked the movements associated with cabin 8142's keycard scans. The footage showed a figure entering and exiting the cabin at the logged times, but the image quality degraded whenever the figure appeared on camera. The same blur effect from the photos manifested in the video footage. I could see the cabin door opening, see the distorted shape of a person entering or exiting, but no identifiable features, no clothing details, no characteristics that would allow recognition. The IT department confirmed the camera systems were functioning normally, showed no technical malfunctions, and captured clear footage of every other passenger and crew member. Only this one passenger from cabin 8142 appeared with a consistent blur distortion. I expanded my investigation beyond the current sailing. I searched historical booking records for cabin 8142 going back 6 months. The pattern was impossible to dismiss. 6 previous sailings showed identical bookings. Same cabin, full payment processed, keycard activations recorded, dining and spa reservations completed. Each booking showed the same data error in the passenger name field. Each sailing had housekeeping notes confirming occupancy and service completed. Each sailing had multiple staff members who remembered interactions but couldn't provide physical descriptions. Each sailing had photographs showing the same blur distortion. Cabin 8142 had been occupied by this unidentifiable passenger on 7 consecutive sailings over 4 months. And I was the first person to notice the pattern. Because I was the first person to actually inspect the physical cabin and discover it was empty despite all records indicating occupancy. I contacted our corporate security office and reported the anomaly. They requested I compile complete documentation, booking records, keycard logs, staff interviews, security footage, photo evidence. I spent 12 hours assembling a comprehensive report detailing every inconsistency, every blurred image, every staff member who remembered service interactions with a passenger they couldn't describe. I submitted the report at 11:37 p.m. on May 13th. At 11:52 p.m., my desk phone rang. The caller ID displayed cabin 8142. I answered using my standard greeting, identifying myself and asking how I could assist. A voice responded, calm and pleasant, thanking me by name for my attention to detail throughout the cruises. The voice said they appreciated my dedication to guest services and hoped to see me again on future sailings. Then the line disconnected. The voice had used my full name, including my middle name that only appears in employee records not accessible to passengers. The voice had referred to cruises, plural, suggesting knowledge of the historical pattern I'd just discovered. And the call had come from a cabin that was physically empty, but somehow still connected to the ship's phone system with a passenger actively using it. I went to cabin 8142 immediately, bringing security with me. We entered at 12:07 a.m. The cabin was empty. The phone showed no outgoing calls in its digital log. Security checked the corridor cameras. No one had entered or exited cabin 8142 since my last inspection at 4:02 p.m. The corporate security office responded to my report with instructions to monitor the situation and provide updates. They didn't express disbelief or suggest I was mistaken. They simply acknowledged the report and requested continued documentation. That response frightened me more than if they dismissed my findings, because it suggested they'd encountered similar patterns before. The current sailing ended May 14th with normal disembarkation. Cabin 8142 showed a keycard scan exiting the ship at 8:34 a.m. Security footage showed the blurred figure leaving through the gangway. Port immigration systems logged a departure scan using the unreadable passenger name from our manifest. And housekeeping reported finding the cabin empty and clean, requiring only standard turnover service for the next sailing. I checked the next sailing's manifest. Cabin 8142 was booked. Same data error on the passenger name. Payment already processed. I watched the embarkation footage. At 11:41 a.m., a blurred figure scanned a keycard and boarded the ship. At 1:23 p.m., the housekeeping steward serviced cabin 8142 and reported finding personal belongings present. I physically inspected the cabin at 2:00 p.m. Empty. No luggage, no belongings, no occupancy evidence. But the records showed activation. The steward reported service completion. And somewhere on this ship, other passengers were beginning to interact with someone from cabin 8142. Someone they would remember meeting but never be able to describe. That pattern has continued for 8 more sailings since May. Cabin 8142 books every cruise, checks in according to records, interacts with staff and passengers who remember the encounters, appears in photographs as a blur, and pays for services rendered. But the cabin remains physically empty every time I inspect it, and no one can provide a description of the passenger despite multiple documented interactions. I've stopped filing detailed reports. Corporate security acknowledged the first one and requested I simply note when the pattern continues. I maintain a private log documenting each sailing, each inspection, each blurred photograph, each staff member who remembers service interactions with a passenger they cannot describe. The log has grown to 43 pages of documentation, proving someone is simultaneously existing and not existing on this ship. Other guest services staff have started noticing similar patterns with different cabins. Always interior staterooms, always with the data error on passenger names, always with the blur effect in photographs and security footage. The passengers pay their bills, keep their reservations, interact politely with staff and other guests, and leave no verifiable evidence of physical presence despite comprehensive documentation of their activities. I'm 33 years old, and I used to believe that administrative systems were reliable, that documentation reflected truth, that records could be trusted to match reality. Now I know that someone can book a cruise, check in, eat meals, get spa treatments, socialize with other passengers, and call me by my full name while never physically occupying the cabin they've paid for and never appearing clearly in any photograph or video footage. Cabin 8142 is booked for the next sailing. The passenger will check in, the key card will activate, The housekeeping steward will service an occupied room. Dining staff will remember serving them. And I will inspect an empty cabin while photographs show a blur where a person should be. And somewhere in that impossible space between documented existence and physical absence, someone who knows my name will continue traveling on cruises they may or may not actually be taking, staying in cabins that are simultaneously occupied and empty, existing in records while remaining invisible to every camera and unmemorable to every person who claims to have met them. My name is Captain Eric, and for the past 12 years, I've commanded luxury cruise vessels through some of the most challenging waters in the world. 3.5 decades of maritime service have taught me to trust instruments over instinct, to rely on technology over intuition, and to document everything with precision that satisfies regulators, insurers, and corporate oversight. My bridge is run by protocols refined through thousands of safe passages. My navigation decisions are backed by redundant systems that cross-verify every position, every course correction, every temporal reference. Which is why I cannot officially report what happened on September 17, 2023, during a routine night watch in the inside passage near Petersburg, Alaska, because the navigation data from that night proved something impossible occurred, and filing an accurate report would end my career by making me seem either incompetent or mentally unstable. I'm writing this as a personal document, not an official log entry. The distinction matters because official logs are legal records subject to maritime law, Coast Guard review, and corporate scrutiny. What I document officially affects insurance, regulatory compliance, and my professional standing. What I document personally is simply an attempt to record something I cannot explain using any principle of navigation, physics, or maritime operations I've learned throughout my entire career. September 17, 2023. We were sailing the inside passage aboard a Regent Seven Seas vessel. Luxury cruise line, 490 passengers, 380 crew members, ship value approximately $450 million. My responsibility, my command. The night was exceptionally clear, visibility unlimited, seas calm with minimal swell, ideal navigation conditions. I was conducting routine bridge watch from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., personally overseeing night operations as I do several times each voyage to maintain direct familiarity with ship systems and crew performance. At 3:07 a.m., the officer of the watch brought an anomaly to my attention. The radar display was showing our vessel in 2 positions simultaneously. Primary return showed our actual position at coordinates that matched GPS confirmation. Secondary return showed another vessel bearing our exact same signature 40 nautical miles ahead on our course line, also transmitting as our vessel. Initial assumption: radar malfunction or signal reflection creating a ghost image. Common enough in certain atmospheric conditions or near large landmasses that create radar echoes. I ordered the officer to run diagnostics on the radar system. All systems reported normal operation, no malfunctions, no atmospheric conditions that would create false returns. The secondary contact remained stable, maintaining position 40 miles ahead, moving at the same speed and course as our actual vessel. I checked the automatic identification system, the mandatory tracking technology that broadcasts vessel identity, position, course, and speed. Our AIS transponder was functioning normally, transmitting our vessel identification and position data. But the system was also receiving an AIS signal from the contact 40 miles ahead. And that signal was broadcasting our exact vessel identification number, our ship's name, our MMSI number, all the unique identifiers that should be exclusive to our vessel. 2 ships cannot have the same AIS identification. It's technically impossible. The system is designed specifically to prevent such duplication. Each vessel has unique identification codes registered internationally. Yet our navigation systems were receiving valid AIS signals from two sources, both claiming to be our ship, one at our current position and one 40 miles ahead. I ordered GPS position verification from three independent systems: ship's primary GPS, backup GPS, and handheld GPS unit. All three confirmed our position with precision accuracy, matching our chart plotting and coastal reference points visible through bridge windows. We were exactly where we should be. But radar and AIS insisted we were also 40 miles ahead of ourselves. I attempted radio contact with the forward vessel on VHF Channel 16, the International Hailing and Distress Frequency. I transmitted, "Vessel at position 56°48N, 102°57W. This is Regent 7C's ship requesting identification and clarification of AIS signal conflict." The response came back after a 7-second delay. It was my own voice, speaking the exact words I'd just transmitted, with the same inflection, the same pacing, the same tone. Not an echo, not a recording, but a delayed duplicate of my transmission occurring 7 seconds after I'd finished speaking. What technology reflects your own voice back to you with perfect fidelity and temporal delay, while claiming to be 40 miles away? I had the communications officer verify the radio system. No malfunctions. Normal transmission and reception across all frequencies. I attempted contact again, modifying my words. "Vessel showing as Regent 7C's ship at forward position. Please confirm your actual vessel name and registration." 7-second delay. Then my voice responded with the exact words I'd just spoken. The officer of the watch heard it. The helmsman heard it. The communications officer recorded it. We were receiving radio transmissions of my own voice, delayed by 7 seconds, apparently originating from a position 40 miles ahead, where radar and AIS showed a duplicate of our vessel. I made a command decision that I've questioned every day since. I ordered course adjustment to intercept the forward contact. If something was ahead of us broadcasting our identification and reflecting our signals, I needed to physically verify what it was. Maritime law requires investigation of navigation anomalies that could affect safety of navigation. My decision was defensible under standard protocols. We increased speed from 12 knots to 18 knots, maximum safe speed for night navigation in the inside passage. Course was adjusted to converge with the forward contact's position. I calculated intercept time at approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes if the forward contact maintained its current speed and course. The forward contact did not maintain speed and course. As we accelerated, it decelerated. As we closed the distance, the gap between positions decreased faster than our speed differential should allow. The radar showed both contacts converging as if drawn together by mutual attraction rather than following independent navigation decisions. At 4:23 a.m., we reached the coordinates where the forward contact had been displayed. The radar showed both positions overlapping. Both returns merged into a single contact at our actual location. The duplicate AIS signal ceased. The radio transmissions stopped. All navigation systems showed normal operation with only one vessel, our vessel, at our confirmed position. I checked ship's chronometers. Bridge clock showed 4:23 a.m. GPS time showed 4:23 a.m. But my personal watch, which I'd synchronized with ship's time at the beginning of my watch, showed 5:10 a.m., 47 minutes ahead of ship's time. I ordered the officer of the watch to check his watch. He reported 5:09 a.m., 46 minutes ahead of bridge chronometers. The helmsman reported 5:11 a.m. on his watch. 3 independent personal timepieces all showed we were approximately 47 minutes further into the morning than ship's synchronized clocks indicated. We verified with multiple time sources. Ship's GPS timestamps satellite communication time codes, Coast Guard atomic clock synchronization, all confirmed 4:23 a.m. Our watches, which had been correct at the beginning of the watch, now showed 5:10 a.m. Somehow, we had experienced 47 minutes that ship's systems insisted hadn't occurred. I ordered retrieval of the encrypted navigation data recorder, the maritime equivalent of a flight data recorder that continuously logs all bridge operations, navigation commands, system status, and timestamps with encrypted security preventing tampering. The data is used for incident investigation and regulatory compliance audits. The encrypted logs showed continuous normal operations from 3:07 a.m. through 4:23 a.m. 76 minutes of routine sailing, steady course, steady speed, no navigation anomalies recorded. According to the encrypted data, we had simply sailed normally through the time period when we detected the duplicate vessel, attempted radio contact, altered course for intercept, and experienced the convergence event. The logs showed no course changes, no speed adjustments, no radio transmissions, no radar anomalies. Just smooth, routine sailing for 76 minutes, while my watch indicated only 29 minutes had elapsed. And my memory recorded a series of events that the ship's official systems insisted never occurred. I interviewed passengers who had been awake during the time period. Several were in the observation lounge, some were in the casino. A few were taking early morning walks on deck. None reported anything unusual. None experienced missing time or temporal discontinuity. Their watches matched ship's time. Their memories matched the encrypted navigation logs showing routine sailing with no incidents. Only the three of us on the bridge experienced the 47-minute discrepancy. Only we remembered the duplicate radar contact, the impossible AIS signals, the radio transmissions of my own delayed voice. And only our personal watches showed time that didn't match ship's synchronized systems. Can three people simultaneously experience 47 minutes that didn't occur for anyone else while sailing through space, that navigation systems prove we traversed normally? I faced an impossible choice. File an official report documenting navigation anomalies that encrypted logs proved didn't happen, or remain silent about an incident that involved objective technical evidence witnessed by qualified officers. Either option threatened my authority and credibility. I chose silence. I logged routine night operations with no incidents. I advised the officer of the watch and helmsman that we would not be filing official reports about the anomaly. Both understood the implications immediately. A captain reporting impossible navigation data becomes a captain under fitness for command review. We synchronized our watches to ship's time, deleted the radio transmission recording, and continued normal operations as if nothing had occurred. But I kept the radar screenshots. I downloaded them to a personal device before they cycled out of the system's temporary storage. I have images showing 2 radar contacts with identical vessel signatures separated by 40 nautical miles. I have AIS data logs showing duplicate identification signals from impossible positions. I have evidence that I cannot officially acknowledge because it proves something that maritime navigation principles say cannot happen. 3 more times over the following year, I've experienced similar incidents. Always during night watch in the inside passage, always with clear weather and calm seas. Duplicate radar contacts, impossible AIS signals, radio transmissions of my own voice delayed by seconds. And always the same temporal discrepancy, 45 to 50 minutes missing from personal timepieces while ship systems show continuous normal operations. Other captains have mentioned similar experiences during private conversations at maritime conferences. Always off the record, always with the understanding that official reports would end careers. We describe the duplicate contacts, the temporal discontinuities, the navigation data that shows 2 simultaneous positions for vessels that can only be in one place. And we all maintain official silence, because the choice is between reputation and truth. And in Maritime Command, reputation is everything. 3 years remain until my retirement. I command a vessel worth nearly $500 million. I'm responsible for thousands of lives during every voyage. And I know, with absolute certainty based on objective navigation data, that on at least 4 occasions my ship has been in 2 positions simultaneously, has communicated with itself across 40 miles of ocean, and has experienced time periods that official encrypted logs prove never occurred. The radar screenshots remain on my personal device. The AIS data logs are stored in files I'll never submit for official review. The memory of hearing my own voice respond to my radio transmissions with 7-second delay remains clear despite encrypted navigation recorders showing I made no transmissions during that period. And somewhere in the inside passage, under specific conditions I haven't identified, ships travel through space and time in ways that navigation systems can detect, but cannot officially acknowledge without destroying the careers of captains who report what their instruments show them. My name is Maria, and I've spent 23 years working housekeeping on cruise ships. Started when I was 22, fresh from the Philippines with a contract that promised good money to send home to my family. Back then, I cleaned cabins and thought the hardest part of this job would be the physical work, the long hours, the homesickness. I didn't know that ships remember things. I didn't know that crew members who die sometimes don't really leave. My grandmother in Manila used to tell stories about spirits that linger in places where they worked, where they belonged, where they felt purpose. I thought those were just old superstitions from the provinces, the kind of folklore you leave behind when you move to the modern world of cruise ships with computer systems and safety regulations. But after 23 years working crew quarters on a dozen different vessels, I've learned that my grandmother was right about more things than I wanted to believe. November 18th, 2022. We were docked overnight in Ketchikan, Alaska. Norwegian cruise line vessel, end of the Alaska season before repositioning to warmer routes. Most passengers were ashore enjoying their last port day. Crew was busy with inventory checks, equipment maintenance, deep cleaning that's easier to do when the ship is stationary and passenger areas are less busy. I was conducting housekeeping inventory on E-deck, the crew accommodation level deep in the ship where passengers never go and most crew members only see when walking to and from their cabins. I supervise 17 housekeeping staff, mostly Filipino like me, a few Indonesian, 1 Romanian. We're responsible for crew quarters, crew mess areas, laundry facilities, and storage spaces that keep the ship running but never appear in glossy brochures. Late shift inventory means checking supplies, verifying cleaning equipment, making sure everything is accounted for before we sail to the next port. Routine work I've done thousands of times. At 10:47 p.m., I was walking the E-deck corridor checking cabin numbers against my assignment sheet. Crew quarters are numbered systematically, E101 through E247. Each cabin housing 2 to 4 crew members depending on rank and seniority. The corridor lighting is dim compared to passenger decks, just enough to navigate safely without wasting electricity in areas where crew members are usually sleeping between shifts. I noticed a cabin door slightly open near the end of the corridor. Cabin E118. That was unusual because crew members are strict about keeping doors locked when they're not inside. Too many shared spaces, too much valuable personal property, too easy for things to go missing if you're careless. I checked my assignment sheet. E189 wasn't listed. Not marked as occupied, not marked as vacant for maintenance, just absent from the current crew quarter assignments entirely. I knocked on the door frame and called out, asking if anyone was inside. No response. I pushed the door, open wider, and looked in. The cabin was occupied. Not just occupied, but actively lived in. Someone's belongings were spread across the small space, clothes folded on the bunk, personal photographs taped to the wall, toiletries arranged on the small shelf by the sink, a schedule posted on the cabin door showing shift rotations with dates from the current month. The bed was unmade, sheets rumpled like someone had just gotten up. A phone was charging on the small desk, the screen showing 63% battery. A coffee mug sat on the desk, with liquid still in it, lukewarm when I touched it. A uniform jacket hung on the back of the chair with a name tag pinned to it. I leaned closer to read the name. The name on that tag stopped me cold. I remembered that crew member. I remembered them dying 19 years ago. When you work ships long enough, you know the names that aren't supposed to exist anymore. The faces that should only be in old crew photos locked away in maritime archives. It was 2003, different ship but same cruise line. I was new then, only in my second year of contracts, still learning how everything worked. There was a medical emergency in crew quarters. One of the housekeeping staff collapsed during their shift. Heart attack, the doctor said later. They tried to resuscitate, but it happened too fast, too severe. The crew member died in the medical bay, while the ship was at sea. We held a small service before the body was transferred to authorities at the next port. I remember because it was the first time I'd experienced death on a ship. The first time I understood that we work in a community isolated from normal life, where tragedy happens far from home and family. The name on that uniform tag was the crew member who died in 2003. I was certain. I remembered the name, remembered the memorial service, remembered sending money to help with the family's expenses back in the Philippines, because that's what we do for each other. I stepped fully into the cabin, trying to understand what I was seeing. The photographs on the wall showed recent images. One photo showed crew members I recognized from current staff, people who hadn't even been born in 2003, posing together in what looked like a recent crew party. Another photo showed Ketchikan Harbor with a date stamp from last month. A shore pass lay on the desk with today's date, stamped and validated by port security. The schedule posted on the door showed housekeeping shift rotations for November 2022. The name from the tag appeared on the schedule, assigned to passenger deck cleaning, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. shift. Everything in this cabin suggested current, active occupancy by someone who should have been dead for 19 years. I left the cabin quickly and found 2 other housekeeping supervisors who were working late shift. I didn't explain what I'd found, just asked them to come with me to check something on E-deck. When we reached the corridor where cabin E-189 should be, the door was still open. We entered together. Both supervisors recognized the name on the uniform tag. One of them had worked with that crew member back in 2003, had been friends, had attended the memorial service. She stood in the cabin, staring at the belongings, the photographs, the schedule, and started crying. She said she'd been in this cabin before. Multiple times over the years, she said she sometimes came here when she was homesick or tired, sat on the bunk, talked to the empty space like her old friend was still listening. She said the cabin was always here, always had these same belongings, always felt like someone was maintaining it, even though she knew that was impossible. The other supervisor confirmed the same experience. She'd accessed this cabin during her shifts for at least 5 years. She said other crew members knew about it too, that it was an open secret among Filipino housekeeping staff. The cabin that shouldn't exist, where a friend who died was somehow still living, still working shifts, still part of the crew rotation, even though official records said otherwise. We went to the crew administration office and asked IT to look up cabin E-189. The technician searched the current crew quarter database. No results. Cabin E-189 didn't exist in the active system. He searched historical records going back to 2000. Cabin E-189 appeared in databases through 2003, then was deleted from the system in January 2004, 2 months after the crew member's death. The database deletion note indicated cabin decommissioned following incident, space reallocated to ventilation system expansion. But we had just been inside that cabin. We had touched the belongings, seen the photographs, read the schedule showing current shifts. The space physically existed with active occupancy, even though the system said it had been deleted and converted to mechanical space 20 years ago. I asked IT to check the crew member's employment status. Deceased, terminated January 2004. Death certificate on file, final wages paid to family, employment officially ended. But that same crew member's name appeared on current housekeeping rotation schedules that IT printed out for me. The name was scheduled for shifts next week, assigned to the same passenger deck cleaning duties they'd performed before dying. We returned to E-Deck with 3 more witnesses, 2 crew members who'd known the deceased and 1 engineer who could verify the physical layout of the deck. We walked to the corridor where cabin E-189 should be. The door was closed now, locked. I tried my supervisor master key. It wouldn't turn, like the lock didn't recognize my keycard as valid. The engineer pulled up deck plans on his tablet. According to current structural diagrams, the space where we'd found cabin E-189 was marked as mechanical equipment access, housing ventilation ductwork installed during a 2004 refit. There should be no cabin there. Just a narrow maintenance space with HVAC equipment. We knocked on the door. No response. The engineer used his maintenance master key. Still wouldn't open. He examined the door frame more carefully, running his hand along the edges. Then he stopped and looked at us with confusion. He said the door wasn't a door. It was solid wall with a decorative panel that looked like a door, but had no actual opening mechanism, no frame depth, no hinges. It was a false door, architectural decoration that mimicked crew quarter entrances, but wasn't functional. Yet 20 minutes earlier, 5 of us had been inside that cabin. We had physical memories of walking through that doorway, standing in that space, touching belongings that were real and solid. Now the door was a wall, and engineering diagrams insisted no cabin could exist in that location. How does a room stop existing while you still have the warmth of coffee from its desk on your fingertips? I asked the other supervisors, who'd confirmed accessing the cabin previously. When was the last time they'd been inside? One said 3 days ago, one said last week. Both described the same belongings, the same photographs, the same sense that someone was actively living there, even though they knew the crew member was dead. The engineer checked HVAC systems in that section. His diagnostic equipment showed active air circulation in the space behind the false door. Temperature regulation consistent with occupied quarters rather than mechanical spaces. Humidity levels matching crew cabins rather than equipment areas. His sensors detected a space that shouldn't exist according to deck plans. Maintaining environmental conditions for human occupancy, even though the ship's system said only ventilation equipment was present. Over the next 3 days, I talked to 14 different crew members, all Filipino housekeeping or dining staff, all with at least 5 years on this vessel. 9 of them confirmed knowing about cabin E-189. They described accessing it occasionally, finding it always maintained with the same belongings, sometimes leaving small offerings like we do for the dead back home. A piece of candy, a small prayer card, a photograph. They said it was a place where you could feel close to someone who died far from their family, a place where grief could exist in a community that doesn't have time or space for mourning. None of them thought it was strange. In their understanding, shaped by cultures that accept the coexistence of living and dead, the cabin was simply where a crew member continued to reside. The fact that the crew member had died didn't change their belonging to the ship, their place in our community, their right to occupy space in crew quarters where they'd worked and lived. The smartphone charging in the cabin bothered me most. I'd seen it clearly, recognized it as a current model, newer than my own phone. How does someone who died in 2003 own a smartphone that didn't exist until 15 years later? How do they charge it in a cabin that doesn't appear in ship's electrical systems? I tried accessing cabin E189 twice more over the following week. Once the door was a solid wall. Once it was slightly open and I could see inside again. But when I tried to enter, the space disappeared, becoming too narrow to fit through, collapsing into impossible geometry that my eyes couldn't process. I stopped trying after that. The crew member's name still appears on housekeeping rotation schedules. IT has tried deleting it multiple times, but it reappears in the next schedule generation, assigned to consistent shifts, marked as active crew. The payroll system doesn't generate payments for that name because it's flagged as deceased in HR records. But the scheduling algorithm treats it as a valid crew member requiring shift assignments. Other ships in the Norwegian fleet have similar stories. Crew quarters that exist in memory and experience, but not in official deck plans. Names on rotation schedules for people who died years ago, but somehow continue working shifts that other crew members swear are being completed. Spaces where the dead remain employed, where death doesn't mean leaving the ship, where belonging persists beyond the administrative finality of termination paperwork. My grandmother would understand this better than any ship's engineer or IT technician. She would say that people who die doing work they loved, in communities they belonged to, don't always leave completely. They maintain their space, continue their purpose, exist in the gaps between what systems track and what humans experience. After 23 years on ships, I've learned to accept these gaps. Cabin E189 exists when it needs to, when crew members need a place to remember, to grieve, to maintain connection with someone who died. The ship accommodates this need by preserving space that officially doesn't exist, by maintaining environmental systems for a cabin deleted from databases, by keeping someone's belongings present and current even though that person has been dead for 19 years. I don't question it anymore. I note the cabin in my private records, but not in official reports. I make sure other supervisors know it's there when they need it. And sometimes, when I'm tired and homesick and missing people I've lost over 2 decades at sea, I find the door unlocked and go inside to sit on that bunk, surrounded by belongings that shouldn't exist, feeling the presence of a community that extends beyond life and death, maintained by ships that remember their crew better than any database ever could. These 10 stories came from real people who work and travel the Pacific Northwest waters. Names and details have been changed, but the experiences are genuine. If you've encountered something unexplainable on a cruise ship, you're not alone. The ocean keeps secrets, and ships remember everything. Subscribe to Mr. Nightveil for more true horror stories from places most people never see. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the impossible becomes documented reality.